Chapter 295. The moment she entered the door, the figure in the black shirt on the wooden chair didn't move. As she hurriedly approached, he opened his eyes. His deep black eyes fell on her face. Without Dali's supervision, Jinwan hurriedly ran up to Mo Jingshan, handed him the water in the tray and whispered, "Feng Ling and Nanheng will be here soon. There will be a war here. Those people have been harassed by the sound of the helicopter. No one can see them now. You need strength. Drink some water." Jinwan hadn't said a word for more than 2 days. Her voice was a little hoarse, but he could hear her clearly. Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes and looked at Jinwan's hand, which was still wrapped in white cloth. At this time he had no time to ask her why she came to Cambodia and why she was caught here. When he saw her fingers were redder and swollen than yesterday, a cold look flashed across his face. At the same time Mo Jingshan's eyes turned cold and he said in a low voice, "Someone is coming." Jinwan, who was about to feed him water, suddenly paused, took a step back, held the bowl with both hands, and continued to stand there timidly as if asking him to eat. Hearing that Jinwan came to deliver food early in the morning as he asked, Dali took the time to come over and take a look. Outside the door, he saw Jinwan trembling in fear and then glanced at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan sat there without a trace of expression on his face. The water and food in the bowl were still untouched. There was no time to keep an eye on this woman today. After saying a few words to the people outside the wooden house, Dali turned back to Akib with a cold face. But at this time the people outside had already fixed their eyes on them. Jinwan calmly looked up at Mo Jingshan. The sound of the helicopter was getting closer and closer. It had never been so close last night. The camp was in a mess. Seeing Jinwan standing in the room without speaking or moving and Mo Jingshan's face was cold, the men outside the room saw Jinwan standing in the room without speaking or moving, and Mo Jingshan's face was cold. After watching for a while, they took their guns to go to the front to see what was going on, leaving only 2 men outside, but they also looked inside for a long time and couldn't see anything, so they didn't pay special attention to the movements inside. Jinwan stared at Mo Jingshan. When she saw the man nod silently, she abruptly pushed open the door and ran out, screaming in a panic. As she ran, she pointed at the roar of the approaching helicopters in the sky as if she were frightened. The 2 men guarding outside saw her desperately running out. In this situation, anyone who had nothing to do with their gang was very suspicious. Seeing that she ran, the 2 men simply raised their guns and aimed in her direction, planning to kill her directly to avoid future trouble. Just as the 2 of them focused on aiming at Jinwan, they didn't notice the man coming out of the wooden house behind them, nor did they notice that the man was holding 2 hard stone bowls in his hands. The bowls immediately hit the most vulnerable part of their necks. When the 2 of them came to their senses and were about to raise their guns back, it was too late. Because of the dull pain in the back of their necks and the momentary numbness in their heads, their movements slowed down a lot. In the blink of an eye, the 2 guns were snatched away by the man. Then he bent his arm and hit their eyes and abdomen hard with his elbow. The 2 of them had no time to resist and were pressed to the ground. The 2 of them lay on the ground, shouting a lot of words, but they couldn't raise their voices, so they couldn't call for help from the people in front of the camp. They didn't expect that this person who hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days still had strength. Jinwan didn't run far. If she ran too far and was found by the people in front, she would only alert the enemy. Noticing Mo Jingshan's situation, she suddenly turned and ran back. Fortunately, she had specially taken 2 polished stone bowls from the cooking tent today. The bowls used here were all rough wood bowls and stone bowls. When Dali was watching her, she had always taken the safe wooden bowls. Today, when Dali was not with them and the old woman was not paying attention, she secretly took the stone bowls. It turned out that they really came in handy. As soon as she rushed back, she saw Mo Jingshan put the guns on the heads of the 2 men. The man's black shirt was a little wrinkled, and his hair was slightly messy. He hadn't taken care of his appearance for many days. His stubble was faintly visible, but his eyes were as sharp as blades, dark and piercingly cold. Jinwan hadn't seen Mo Jingshan holding a gun, but in this environment full of desperados, whoever had a gun could protect himself. She paused, abruptly picked up 2 palm-sized stones on the ground, ran over, and smashed them hard on the heads of the 2 men. Seeing that they were knocked unconscious, she let out a long breath. When she raised her eyes again, she saw Mo Jingshan raise his eyes. He didn't speak but just stared at her. "I think they just fainted," Jinwan said with some uncertainty. She hadn't killed anyone, but these 2 stones should be very powerful, not to mention they were hit on the head. Even if they didn't die, they should be disabled. Mo Jingshan withdrew his gaze. Seeing that the 2 men were really motionless, he stood up. But when he walked out of the cabin, The strength he had accumulated for a long time could only last for a while. After all, he hadn't eaten for 4 or 5 days, so he staggered when he got up. Jinwan quickly stepped forward to grab his arm and help him up. The man slowly stood up, checked the remaining bullets in the 2 guns in his hands, and stuffed one of them into Jinwan's sleeve. Jinwan's white dress had no pockets, and only the wide sleeves could barely hold some things. "How are you?" Jinwan couldn't care about anything else but stared at his pale face. But even though he hadn't eaten for several days, she could still feel the strength of the man's body as she held his arm. Mo Jingshan didn't answer but just took a deep look at her. Listening to the roar that was getting closer and closer, he asked, "Why are you here?" The fear and grievance she had hidden in her heart for so many days almost burst out with his belated question. Jinwan held back her tears and glared at him resentfully. "You asked me to wait for you to come back and you said you would take me back to High City, but you didn't go at all. Since you didn't go, I had to come to you." She said it easily. How could she come to a place like Cambodia so easily? Jinwan. The man looked at her seriously. Now he had no time to argue with her why she came to Cambodia, nor did he have time to ask her why she was caught here. He said seriously, "From now on, follow me closely. When Nan Heng and his men arrive, immediately leave with them. You must be obedient and can't be willful, understand?" Jinwan wanted to say that if she went with them, what would he do? Would he stay and deal with these fugitives? Chapter 296. This place could be bombarded by helicopters at any time. Mo Jingshan was about to take Jinwan to the dense forest behind. Hearing her words, he suddenly turned to look at her. Seeing that the man suddenly stared at her without saying a word, his long and deep gaze falling on her, she was afraid that he would think she was joking, so she raised her hand and grabbed his arm hard, saying clearly, "You didn't hear wrong, Mo Jingshan. I'm pregnant." The man stood in front of her without moving. Jinwan had wanted to use the pregnancy to make him feel a little better, but from his cold eyes she could tell that he was not only not happy, but also wanted to scold her. She was pregnant, yet she still came to this kind of place. Indeed, she needed a lesson. Jinwan was very self-aware and complained in her heart. Before he could speak, she suddenly stood on tiptoe and hugged his neck, pulling his body down. "Don't be angry. Even if I'm about to give birth, I won't be able to stay in High City and wait for you to come back. Mo Jingshan, if I'm in your shoes and I'm in danger, you'll definitely want to stand on the same land as me as soon as possible. Don't drive me away. Although I've been suffering a little humiliation here for the past 2 days, at least I survived and didn't get hurt. I won't die and neither will you." Mo Jingshan's eyes were as dark as ink. He raised his hand to hold the woman in his arms who had vowed to stand on the same land as him, and his arms tightened. In this kind of environment there was no obvious surprise or joy. There was only a silent embrace that hugged her very, very tightly. Finally in his arms. After days of hesitation and fear, she finally found her sense of belonging. "Since you're here, how can I drive you away?" The man's voice was low and husky by her ear. His light breath passed through her hair and he kissed her temple. "But you must be obedient and listen to my arrangements at any time. Don't force yourself, do you hear me?" Jinwan nodded in his arms. Hearing the sound of the helicopter approaching, Mo Jingshan decisively took Jinwan's hand and dragged her into the dense forest behind the cabin. "Stand here and don't move. If there's a bombing, don't go out and run around. They won't bomb a large area. They will only throw things down in a small area to distract these people. Some of the smoke bombs contain smoke and dust, and it will dissipate in 10 minutes. Mo Jingshan brought Jinwan to a small puddle in the forest and was about to take off his shirt. Jinwan immediately understood what he meant. She hurriedly pressed his hand down and took off the white cloth wrapped around her hand. Anyway, it was useless to keep the white cloth wrapped around her hand. After taking it off, she turned around and dipped it in the puddle. Then she folded it and made a gesture of covering her mouth and nose. She then asked him, "Is that what you mean?" Mo Jingshan gave her a look of approval, but when he saw the severely burned skin on the back of her hand, he was silent for 2 seconds before saying, "Stand there and don't move. Wait for me to come back. Wait for me." These 4 words again. Jinwan subconsciously reached out and grabbed his wrist. "What are you going to do?" "I'll go with you. Don't you remember what I said just now?" Mo Jingshan turned to look at her. "Listen to me at any time. Don't force yourself." "Mo Jingshan, I'm already standing with you in such a dangerous place. Where else can I hide? Instead of letting me face the fear of not knowing how long I'll have to wait for you, why don't you let me follow you?" The man looked out indifferently. Although this place wouldn't be affected by the things dropped by the helicopter, Jinwan might face unknown danger at any time. Not to mention that this place was not far from the minefield. Once the desperados in the camp fled in this direction, they would soon find her. In this dense forest, there was no absolutely safe place. Whether she went with him or stayed alone, she might face unknown danger at any time. After hesitating for only 2 seconds, the man took her wrist and led her out. Jinwan relaxed. She held the cloth that had just been soaked in the puddle in one hand and held his hand with the other. The camp was now ready to go. Akib and Dali were calmly arranging every mission. From the beginning, they laid in ambush layer by layer here to suddenly being surrounded by so many helicopters. It only took a blink of an eye. Although measures had been laid to prevent helicopters from coming in and besieging them, they didn't expect that there would be so many helicopters, nor did they expect that the American police would come to support them. They really underestimated Mo Jingshan's influence in the eyes of those Americans. If there were only those people from 11 base, they could try their best, but now so many helicopters had come prepared, and his men hadn't had a rest since last night. Their odds of winning had dropped from 100% to less than 50%. Jinwan and Mo Jingshan were outside their patrol area. She had been standing behind him, so she could only quietly poke her head out to look over there. She was more worried about Mo Jingshan's physical strength. How long could he hold on? Although there were many helicopters, they couldn't land immediately. During this period of waiting, the two of them were in the most dangerous situation. The cabin where Mo Jingshan lived had been searched by them. They couldn't go back or they would be killed. Just as the two of them moved to the back of another cabin, suddenly, Mo Jingshan looked through the window of the cabin in front of him and saw that one of the patrolling men had found them and was quietly loading a gun. He pulled Jinwan and pushed her into the gap behind the haystack on the side of the cabin. Lie down. Don't make a sound. Mo Jingshan quickly pressed the haystack on Jinwan and held the gun at his waist, keeping an inconspicuous distance from the haystack where Jinwan was hiding as fast as possible. But in an instant, the man on the opposite side had come around from the side, raised his gun and aimed at Mo Jingshan. The other patrolling men didn't notice this direction. Only this man raised the long gun in his hand and aimed at him as if to claim credit. Mo Jingshan looked at him calmly. The man's gun was obviously much more powerful than the one in his hand. The man looked at him and smiled, surprised to see Mo Jingshan standing here alone. He asked in English, "Mr. Control, do you really think we dare not kill you? Now we have been surrounded by your men. You are no longer a threatening trump card in our hands. I can kill you at any time." Chapter 297. The man suddenly looked around and finally fixed his eyes on the tall haystack in the corner of the cabin and the gap behind it that could accommodate a person. Mo Jingshan paused because of the man's gaze. He suddenly took the gun from his waist, threw it to the ground and raised one hand above his head. The man's attention immediately returned to Mo Jingshan. Seeing him throw the gun away, he immediately smiled. But Mo Jingshan had always been dangerous, and they all knew how unfathomable he was. Even so, they didn't dare to approach him but just pointed the gun at his head. As long as he dared to move, they could shoot him at any time. At this moment, another man patrolling the cabin noticed the movement here. When he came over, he saw this scene and exchanged a look with the previous man. The two of them stood there with guns at the same time. Jinwan lay in the haystack looking at the scene a few meters away with a pale face. But Mo Jingshan stood there calmly and didn't even look in her direction. Although these desperados were loyal to Akib, they were still desperados. They would try their best to gain the most benefits for themselves, so they were now considering whether to kill Mo Jingshan or bring him to Akib to claim credit for it. Mo Jingshan knew what they were thinking, but he didn't move. Besides, Jinwan was in the haystack not far away. No matter how careful the plan was, it couldn't be more important than her safety and her words. "Mo Jingshan, I'm pregnant." At this moment he couldn't afford to gamble. Suddenly, the man who came later found a corner of the white dress under the haystack. The white dress was given to her by the old woman. It didn't fit her very well and was very long. No matter how hard she tried to hide, the color of the white dress couldn't be hidden too well in the haystack, and there would always be a touch of white that caught their attention. The man narrowed his eyes and pointed the gun at the haystack. Mo Jingshan's temples were throbbing. These people were extremely vicious. If they pointed their guns at him, he could at least fight for a chance of survival. But when it came to Jinwan, he was in danger of shooting at any time. Just as he was about to shoot, Mo Jingshan abruptly moved his feet. The gun that had been thrown to the ground was instantly hooked up and returned to his hands. Seeing that he was about to shoot, the man who came first, not deciding whether to kill him or exchange him for benefits, abruptly pointed his gun at the haystack. Seeing that Mo Jingshan was silent, he did not move rashly. Put the gun down. It was obvious that the person in the haystack was very important to him. The man raised his voice and threatened him. The person who came later suddenly said in a low voice, "Why don't we just kill him first, just in case?" "Okay, come at me." Mo Jingshan threw the gun down again. This time he threw it at their feet. The two men laughed as though they had succeeded. One of them stepped forward and kicked Mo Jingshan's knee. Mo Jingshan knelt heavily on one knee. At the same time, the man hit the back of his head with the butt of the gun. In an instant, his face turned stiff and pale, but in order not to frighten the woman in the haystack, he didn't make a sound. Mo Jingshan's voice was very low. Even so, Jinwan could still hear the danger in it. This place has been surrounded and may be bombed at any time. Instead of pledging allegiance to Akib and becoming a desperado with him, why don't you let me go? I'll fight for a chance of survival with 11 base and the police. There was a brief silence. The two men were hesitating. Indeed, they really didn't expect that the American police, who were usually the most difficult to mobilize, would arrive so quickly and spend so many combat resources on so many helicopters. If they delayed any longer, they would really be waiting to be surrounded and annihilated. The cold muzzle was pressed against Mo Jingshan's head. The eyes of the man who came first were full of hesitation, but the eyes of the man who came later were full of killing intent. He didn't believe that they would really leave a chance of survival if they let him go. At the same time, Jinwan in the haystack knew that she couldn't hide anymore. She felt a strong stick in the haystack, which was probably firewood that had not been split. She held the stick tightly in her hand and slowly prepared to get up. While they were not all paying attention to her, she almost jumped out of the haystack and knocked the man closest to the haystack to the ground. As she rushed over, she hit the wrist of the man in front of her hard with the stick in her hand and knocked the gun out of his hand. The two of them were knocked to the ground by a woman who came out of the haystack, and the gun fell to the side. Mo Jingshan picked up the gun almost immediately, but when he raised his head, the man who fell to the ground first had quickly jumped up and pressed the gun against Jinwan's head. The man grabbed Jinwan's arm and pressed the gun against her temple. He stared at Mo Jingshan coldly. "Let's have a try. Let's see who is faster." The gun against Jinwan's temple was cold. It was a long, cold black gun that Jinwan had never seen in High City or even on TV, glowing with a cold black light. He threatened Mo Jingshan to throw the gun away, but Mo Jingshan held the gun tightly and pointed it at his head, not letting go. The man suddenly sneered and said in Jinwan's ear, "It seems that Mr. Control doesn't care about women. You pretended to be mute and lurked here for 2 or 3 days, but he doesn't even care about your life." The trigger in his hand was slightly pressed, and with a click, it was pressed against her temple. Jinwan's whole body tightened. Mo Jingshan's eyes flickered, and his heart almost stopped beating. At this moment he finally let go. He slowly bent down and put the gun on the ground. At this time the other man had also stood up. He took the opportunity to step forward and pick up the gun again. First he stepped on Mo Jingshan's hand to the ground, then he turned around and slapped Jinwan hard in the face, cursing her, "Bitch." His wrist bone was almost broken by her strike just now. It was so *king painful. He was very cruel and didn't show any mercy to her because she was a woman. Jinwan's head jerked to one side, and her whole body trembled. Her cheeks quickly swelled up and the pain numbed her. She could feel that her mouth was broken by her teeth, and the salty liquid spread on the tip of her tongue. Because of the violent movement, her tied-up hair fell down, covering half of her swollen face. She swallowed the blood and didn't say a word, letting her hair cover her face. In this way Mo Jingshan couldn't see. As long as he couldn't see. Chapter 298. At the same time, the man who had been holding Jinwan suddenly lifted her hair, stared at her for a moment and smiled. 2 days ago, Akib had said that he wanted everyone to have a taste of her. At that time he didn't have the chance to get too close to her. He only knew that this girl was pretty. Now he felt that her skin was soft and tender and she was very beautiful. In particular, her pair of red eyes had a stubborn and unyielding look, which made people want to conquer her. "You risked your life to sneak into our place. Who is Mr. Control to you?" The man suddenly pinched Jinwan's waist through her white dress. "Is he your man?" Jinwan looked at him coldly and didn't speak. "Now your lives are in our hands. Even if I press you down here and *ck you until you cry, I'm afraid your Mr. Control can only watch," the man said and leaned over to kiss her on the cheek. Mo Jingshan struggled to get up, but was kicked in the knee and knocked hard to the ground. He tried to get up again, but the man hit him on the back with the butt of the gun and knocked him hard against a corner of the cabin. Jinwan watched his back hit hard against the corner of the cabin, and at the same time the man hit him hard with the gun at his waist. These people were vicious. Mo Jingshan hadn't eaten for several days. It was a miracle that he could hold on until now. Without a gun in his hand he couldn't fight back at all. Mo Jingshan gritted his teeth and said word by word, "Let her go and I'll go with you. My life can be exchanged for hundreds of millions of dollars at any time. Her existence is of no benefit to you." The man who had just attacked him laughed even more happily. "It seems that you care about this woman very much. Why, is she really your woman?" Mo Jingshan was pressed hard against the wall outside the cabin. Jin Wan was pushed to the ground by another man, and the muzzle was still aimed at her temple. The man unhurriedly pinched Jin Wan's chin and suddenly began to tear her clothes. Jin Wan's white dress was not very thick or cumbersome. In an instant, one side of her shoulder was directly exposed to the air, and her snow-white and delicate skin dazzled the man's eyes. He looked at her greedily. "It looks good. I wonder how it tastes." The disgusting man pressed against her, but she didn't struggle as violently as before. She looked up calmly and said in English, "Let him go. I'll play alone with you too." The man on top of her looked at her and was stunned for a moment. Then he laughed. "What's the point of him leaving? I like doing it in front of your man." Jin Wan lay there motionless, her heart dead silent. From the moment she was caught, she knew that she might not be able to leave. She was already very fortunate to see Mo Jingshan again in such a place. All the regrets she had missed in her previous life were no longer regrets at this moment. At the very least, she finally saw the complete Mo Jingshan, the Mo Jingshan she did not understand, but the Mo Jingshan was so good. To be able to go through life and death with him at this moment, perhaps God had given her a chance to love properly and cherish the man she had missed in her previous life. As someone who had died once, it was not that she was not afraid of death, but at this moment Jin Wan was calmer than she thought. At worst she could bite her tongue and commit suicide. It was not like she had never died before. Perhaps she had more experience than anyone in how to die happily. She just wanted Mo Jingshan to get out of danger. She didn't want to drag him down because of herself. Either way, death was inevitable. Jin Wan could only remain calm. There was no need to struggle. The man had already kissed her face again. She moved her head slightly, and his dark and dirty skin formed a sharp contrast with Jin Wan's fair face. The smell of sweat on the man's body mixed with the smell of blood. Jin Wan felt that her morning sickness was going to break out again and she wanted to vomit. She resisted and said calmly, "With someone watching, I'll be nervous and won't be able to let go. If I don't let him go, you won't feel happy, will you?" Mo Jingshan, who was pressed against the side of the cabin, clenched his fists so hard that his fingertips dug into his palms and his knuckles turned blue and white. Every cell in his body was screaming for him to shoot this bastard. He tried his best to restrain the urge to jump up. His eyes were red, but when the man in front of him was also looking at Jin Wan with a smile, he reached out to pick up the stick that Jin Wan had thrown on the ground. Because Jin Wan was too calm, the two men's attention was on her, and their movements revealed some flaws. The sky seemed to be covered with fog by the approaching helicopter, and the sun in the sky seemed to have been set on fire. Just as the man lying on Jin Wan was about to tear her clothes down, Mo Jingshan suppressed his anger and almost used all his strength to hit the man who was holding him down, knocking him out completely. The man didn't even have the chance to scream or struggle and fell to the ground with a muffled sound. Without any hesitation, Mo Jingshan leaped forward and hit the man who was pulling her clothes. The man had only raised his gun halfway when he was hit in the head. Mo Jingshan rushed up with the intention to kill the two men. The two of them immediately fell to the ground with blood all over their heads. They looked even more miserable than the two guards in front of the wooden hut. Jin Wan hurriedly sat up in embarrassment. She looked up and was a little stunned to see that the once aloof, calm and self-controlled man was now as fierce as a trapped beast. He threw down the stick and punched the man who had just pounced on her in the face. One punch after another, the man had already passed out and his face was covered with bruises. Finally, he let go of the dying man, picked up the gun from the ground and aimed it at him. He pulled the trigger. Seeing that he was going to kill him, Jin Wan rushed up and pressed his hand hard. "Feng Ling said your hands are clean and you didn't do anything. You can't kill people for me. Even if these people deserve to die, Mo Jingshan shouldn't be the one whose hands were stained with blood." She couldn't let this man who had always been pure and handsome fall into the mud for her. "I'll avenge myself." Jin Wan struggled to stand up. She didn't know how to use a long-barreled gun. Besides, if she really fired it here, it would instantly attract the attention of the people in front. She picked up the stick on the ground and hit the unconscious man back and forth as if she was whipping a corpse. In the end, she deliberately hit the base of his leg. The unconscious man cried out in pain, and blood flowed from his lower body. Chapter 299. There was blood all over the ground. She couldn't tell whose it was. Mo Jingshan's black shirt hid the color of the blood, but she knew he had been injured just now. And he was seriously injured. Every part of the butt of the gun was hard and sharp. His back and head must have been riddled with scars. On the narrow, damp land behind the cabin, there was a moment of silence because of the two people who had fallen on the ground. Fortunately, Jin Wan's shirt had an elastic collar at the shoulder, so it was not torn when it was pulled down. Mo Jingshan tugged the shirt on her shoulder up heavily, took her into his arms without a word, and hugged her hard. He hugged her hard, very hard. Almost as soon as the two people fell to the ground, there was a burst of noise in front of them. The helicopters finally surrounded this place tightly. As Mo Jingshan said, a lot of things had been dropped. Mo Jingshan let go of Jin Wan, held her wrist, and pulled her to a place where they would not be hit by the smoke bombs. Mo Jingshan held her tightly. Without saying a word or looking at her again, he pulled her back to the jungle heavily. Her hands, which had been scalded to the point of almost festering, were in so much pain that she felt as if her heart was being torn apart. But Jin Wan endured it without saying a word. She knew this pain was not as painful as the pain he felt when he was pressed under someone's body and almost raped. Jin Wan didn't ask him to be gentle. She knew that this man who had always been rational, had lost his mind at this time. She followed him quietly. In front of her was this man and she could smell his scent. As long as he was still here, nothing was difficult for her. Behind him she didn't know what to say. Because his entire body seemed to be burning with fire, she was a little afraid and didn't know how to coax him. She couldn't even say, "I'm really fine." She had never seen Mo Jingshan like this before. He could have resisted and escaped, but he didn't. He threw the gun away. He would rather be beaten and face the danger of being shot at any time. What? Of course it was to protect her. But she had nowhere to hide. Instead of lying in the haystack and watching him with a gun pointed at his head, she would rather rush out. Live and die together? She hadn't thought about it. She only knew that he was Mo Jingshan, her husband, her man, the father of the child in her belly, and the bright light that had guided her in both her past and present lives. Nothing must happen to him. As they walked into the forest, the two of them did not say a word. The smoke bombs began to fall, and the people who were completely surrounded fled in all directions. Jin Wan put the damp cloth to her nose and turned to look at Mo Jingshan. She covered her nose and mouth. What should he do? With us here they won't release any poisonous smoke. As long as you don't breathe too hard, it won't be a problem. It will only cause panic in these people. But now that you're pregnant, you should avoid these gases as much as possible. He didn't look at her, but he answered the question in her mind. Seeing that Jin Wan at least knew to cover her mouth and nose at this time, Mo Jingshan's anger gradually calmed down a little, but only a little. He regained his senses and slowly let go of her wrist when he felt the uneven scalded skin in his palm. However, he couldn't bear to look at her eyes that were already red from the pain. Stand here. He paused and didn't say that she hated waiting for him to come back. His tone was cold. I won't go too far. His voice was extremely cold. If Jin Wan still followed him out now, he might really lose control. Jin Wan stood where she was and didn't speak. Mo Jingshan stubbornly clung onto the last bit of rationality that was about to be burnt out. Her silence only caused the killing intent in his heart to increase. He abruptly walked out. Jin Wan stood there as he said, didn't move and didn't follow him at all. She saw Mo Jingshan pick up the gun on the ground. When he straightened up, Jin Wan accurately caught a flash of hesitation on his face, which was obviously in pain. His back, his head, and the places she couldn't see were all covered with wounds. Standing in the dense forest, looking at the dense mass of helicopters flying over, she narrowed her eyes and didn't move. She was a little uneasy because she couldn't see the situation in the camp, but Mo Jingshan didn't go far. He seemed to have figured out all the places in the camp before she did and was walking toward the front of the camp. Soon the helicopter landed on an open space closest to Jin Wan. It seemed that Mo Jingshan had known this would be the best place to land. A middle-aged man in an American police uniform quickly got off the helicopter. When he saw Jin Wan, who was not deliberately hiding in the dense forest, he walked up to her with a gun, thinking that she was an accomplice of these people because she was wearing the white dress of the women in this area. Who are you? The policeman looked at her cautiously and seriously. Jin Wan opened her mouth. Although her face was a little dirty, her pure Asian image should be recognized by these people. She raised her hand to wipe her face and said calmly in English, I'm Chinese. I'm Mo Jingshan's wife. Hearing the words Mo Jingshan's wife, the American policeman was puzzled but obviously didn't believe her. At this moment, the door of a black helicopter that landed behind them opened, and Feng Ling rushed out and hurried over. Mrs. Mo. Hearing Feng Ling's voice, the policeman hesitated and slowly put down the gun. Feng Ling quickly stepped forward and grabbed Jinwan's hand. Mrs. Mo, how are you? I'm sorry we're late. We've been waiting for this batch of helicopters to rescue us. After all, the ambush here is very deep. If we don't make thorough preparations, we're likely to fail, but we've been delayed for 2 days. You must have suffered. Before she finished speaking, she suddenly looked down at the back of Jinwan's hand and frowned. Without asking more questions, she pulled Jinwan back to the helicopter. How did your hand get hurt like this? There's a medicine box on the helicopter. Let me help you. I'm fine. As Jinwan was pulled away by Feng Ling, she turned to look in the direction of Mo Jingshan's departure. Where is Mo Jingshan? Mr. Mo should go to meet Nanheng now. Don't worry, Nanheng's plane arrived earlier than us. Now the front has been controlled. The minefield in this dense forest is likely to be detonated by those fleeing people. You're pregnant and can't smell the smoke. It's easy to hurt the baby. Hurry up and get on the helicopter. Chapter 300. The helicopter didn't fly as slowly and steadily as a regular plane. When it took off, Jinwan couldn't hold back her morning sickness anymore. Even if she wanted to ask Mo Jingshan when he would get out of danger with them, she couldn't ask. Because as soon as the helicopter took off, Jinwan ran to the toilet in the bathroom and vomited for a long time. In the end, she knelt by the toilet and lost all her strength. She hadn't eaten much these days, but because she was pregnant and couldn't lack nutrition, she insisted on eating as much as possible, but she didn't eat much. Now she vomited all the food she had eaten in the past few days. When she was pressed to the ground by that disgusting man, she wanted to vomit and had been holding back until now. Mrs. Mo. Feng Ling had found the spare medicine box on the helicopter. She turned around and saw Jinwan lying by the toilet, so she reached out to help her up. Jinwan was helplessly helped out. Sitting in the cabin, Feng Ling took a cushion and put it behind her for Jinwan to lean on. Can you hold on? This helicopter is here to pick you up. Now we'll send you out. You'll feel much better after landing. Just hold on a little longer. It's just morning sickness. I don't have any disease. Jinwan leaned back weakly and looked at her with her eyes slightly open. You don't have to send me out on this helicopter. I'll wait for them with you. You can do whatever you need to do with the people in the base. I can do it alone. Feng Ling looked at her and didn't speak. She just took Jinwan's hand and quickly applied medicine on the back of her hand, asking, Is this a burn? Why is it so hot? I did it on purpose. They asked me to send him food and set up a trap. Whether he ate it or not, it would be the worst result. In order to prevent him from facing this choice, I spilled the whole pot of boiling soup on my hand, Jinwan said in a low voice. Feng Ling paused and then frowned. Perhaps you should let Mr. Mo make the decision. He must have a way to ensure that you won't be implicated. At the same time, he can protect himself. Jinwan was silent for a moment before saying, Indeed, if I had thrown this difficult problem to him, he might have handled it well. But I didn't think that much at that time, so I used the stupidest method. This isn't a stupid method. Perhaps it's because when you've reached a certain level of love, you'd rather be scarred than let the other party suffer. Mrs. Mo, you've already done very well. As Feng Ling spoke, she took out gauze to bandage Jinwan's hand. Let's deal with it this way first. Your injury is a bit too serious. I can't give you medicine casually even though you're pregnant. When you return safely, I'll deal with it properly. Jinwan raised her eyes to look at Feng Ling gratefully. Thank you. The helicopter hovered over the center of the dense camp, neither leaving nor descending. Jinwan no longer felt nauseous because of the stability. She closed her eyes and calmed down for a moment, then turned to lean against the open cabin door with Feng Ling and looked down. They didn't fly very high, so they could still see the messy crowd in the camp under the control of the police, but they didn't see Nanheng, Mo Jingshan, Akib, or Dali. However, she suddenly caught a glimpse of the old woman who had fallen by the tent. The old woman was motionless. She didn't know whether she had fainted or been shot in the random gunfire. Jinwan's heart skipped a beat. This old woman had been with Akib for many years. Although she didn't know whether she was a servant or a relative of Akib, at least in the past few days, this old woman had dressed her, bandaged her hand and protected her. But Jinwan also knew that the old woman was in poor health and couldn't work or cook, so she forced Jinwan to stay here to take over her work. Her original intention might not be good, but if it hadn't been for the old woman's occasional help these 2 days, Jinwan might have been humiliated or faced a more difficult situation. Feng Ling, do you see the old woman by the tent? Jinwan asked. Feng Ling glanced down. I see it. What happened to her? Dead. Their own people shot indiscriminately. She was killed by their own people's guns. There was a moment of silence in the air. Jinwan turned back, leaned against the cabin and no longer looked down. After a moment of silence, she said hoarsely, if these people can leave their bodies intact, please tell them to bury this old woman well. Feng Ling didn't ask more but turned to look at Jinwan's dirty and blood-stained white dress, guessing that it probably belonged to the old woman. After a while there was a commotion below. No matter which side it was, there must be a lot of casualties. Jinwan really couldn't watch anymore. She raised her hand to cover her tumbling stomach and sat there quietly. Mrs. Amo, shall we go back? I'll wait for him here, Jinwan insisted. At this height they were already at a safe distance from the ground. This place wouldn't affect anyone below, so Feng Ling respected Jinwan's choice. If she insisted on staying here with Mr. Amo, Feng Ling wouldn't force her as long as Jinwan's body could bear it. After all, this kind of helicopter with the cabin door open was too torturous for a pregnant woman like Jinwan. She didn't know how much time had passed. Jinwan had been sitting in the cabin, listening to the whirring sound of the propeller, but it gave her a great sense of security. She knew that she had broken free from the camp where she could almost lose her life at any time. Knowing that Mo Jingshan had met up with Nan Hang and the others, she gradually relaxed. She tried not to listen to what was happening below the helicopter. Even if she heard something, she could only treat it as watching a war movie. Otherwise, she would really have nightmares if she saw such a bloody scene. She fell asleep. Time passed bit by bit, and the sun rose from the east to the center and from the center to the west. Suddenly she felt a slight bump in the plane. Jinwan opened her eyes with a jerk, and the moment she turned her head, she heard Feng Ling say, Mrs. Amo, we're landing now. Jinwan responded. He did not know when the cabin door had been closed. No wonder she was sleeping so peacefully. At this moment, Feng Ling suddenly opened the cabin door and heard her say, Mr. Amo is back. Chapter 301. What entered her nose was the refreshing scent of the man's body, mixed with bits of blood, but on his body, it was not unpleasant at all. Jinwan did not even raise her head. She held the man's waist tightly and refused to let go. Feng Ling consciously stood by the side and did not make a sound. She nodded politely and respectfully to Mo Jingshan, who had just come in, and turned to get off the helicopter. There was a metal partition between the cabin and the cockpit. They could not see the front from here, and the pilot in the cockpit could not see them either. Mo Jingshan held the agitated little woman in his arms tightly and silently carried her in. Usually he would carry her as though he was casually picking up a piece of clothing, but right now, the moment he straightened his back, his body trembled and he almost lost his footing. But it did not affect him. When Jinwan sensed his pain and was about to withdraw from his arms, he held her tightly and did not let her move away. You're injured. Jinwan's words were no longer as calm and composed as before in the face of danger. Instead, the lingering fear had covered all her courage. Her hands tightly grasped the blood-stained shirt on his back. Now the blood had dried on his back and the shirt was stuck to the skin on his back. Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes to look at the little woman who only now knew fear. This woman had not even changed her clothes. Aside from her hands being rebandaged, her face was still covered in dirt. Her white dress was mixed with mud and blood. She looked very disheveled, but her eyes were still clear and bright. Why didn't you let Feng Ling send you back? Mo Jingshan asked, his voice right above her head. His voice was as clear and clean as ever, but it was much hoarser and heavier because of the many days of torture. But in Jinwan's ears, it sounded like the world depended on him. He was alive. They were all alive. They were all safe. I don't want to be so far away from you. Feng Ling said it's very safe here and nothing will happen to you. Since it's safe, of course I don't need to leave. Jinwan hugged him tightly, but her hands were careful not to touch his seriously injured back. When can we get out of here completely? You need to see a doctor about your injury. The man gently pulled her hand away from his waist. He lowered his eyes to see that she still had the strength to cry, and the trace of warmth between his brows instantly turned cold. He stared at her with his ink-black eyes. In the future, no matter where I am, you're not allowed to take this risk again. I told you to wait for me, so wait for me obediently. Is Cambodia a place where you can come and go as you please? As expected, the lesson that should have come had still come. Jinwan pursed her lips and did not speak. She raised her reddened eyes to look at him, as though she had turned back into the pitiful little mute who frequently brought him food these past 2 days. No matter how he glared at her, how he coldly, or how he scolded her, she did not speak. Meeting her gaze, Mo Jingshan's chest trembled. What happened today was 100 times more painful for him than for her, and it was even harder for him to get over this hurdle. The moment he thought of the scene where she was almost violated, his sky was about to collapse. He should have sent more people to guard her from the start. If one Fengling was not enough, he should have sent 10 more to keep a close eye on her. He could not give her any chance to take any risks. She was pregnant, yet she still dared to run to Cambodia. This woman was truly audacious. "Why aren't you speaking?" He forcefully controlled his expression to not be too soft-hearted. "I'm waiting for you to finish lecturing me. These past few days I've indeed been shaken to the core. Only after you're done scolding me can I feel a sense of having escaped from a dragon's pool or a tiger's den. That way I'll feel more comfortable." Mo Jingshan's gaze was quiet and dark. "Will you only be satisfied when my heart jumps out of my body?" Jin Wan stared at him, her hands tugging at his blood-stained black shirt. "I only want you to live." In that instant he felt an unbearable piercing pain in his eyes. In the 26 years of his life, other than a few teardrops around the age of 2 when he was learning to speak, the man, who had never shed a single tear since he was 3, was almost instantly blinded by the stinging sensation. His eyes turned bloodshot. "Mo Jingshan, I only want you to live. Even if you didn't come to T-City to pick me up as promised, I'll still come to find you. As long as you're alive, I can go anywhere to find you. In the sky or on the ground, in the past or present life, as long as you're around, I'll overcome all obstacles. I only want you to live." The man abruptly kissed her. There was a salty and fishy taste in his mouth. It was the taste of blood. Previously, when he was injured, he had forcefully swallowed the blood in his throat to prevent Jinwan from worrying. Jinwan took into account that she had just vomited several hours ago. Even though she had rinsed her mouth, she had not brushed her teeth for several days. Mo Jingshan did not eat or drink anything. Aside from the smell of blood, there was nothing else on him. He was as clear and clean as ever, but she felt that right now she might be stinky. She struggled in his arms, but the man kissed her even deeper. He held the back of her head tightly and circled her as if he wanted to rub her into his body. In the past, whether it was in T-City or High City, she was a spoiled young lady who had to shower twice a day. He was also the high and mighty CEO of MO Corporation who was obsessed with cleanliness to a certain extent. But at this moment, throwing away the blood-stained ground and the shackles of various identities and habits, there was only him and her here. It was pure him and her. The last string of reason in Mo Jingshan's mind was almost broken by her. Reason and responsibility, marriage and kindness, and the growing strong feelings for each other could not compare to this woman whose heart was more determined than his at this moment. He was afraid that in this life he would really be completely buried in her hands. Gradually Jinwan stopped struggling. Her entire body leaned into his embrace. This was compromise, this was submission, and she did not want to resist anymore. She hugged his neck tightly and took the initiative to kiss him back. Finally, the hand that was hugging the back of his neck instinctively moved to stroke his hair. Her fingers had just brushed past the back of his head when the man suddenly paused. He released her lips and gave a low moan. It was clear that he was in so much pain that he could no longer hold it in. Jinwan subconsciously rushed to put down her hand. When she lowered her head, she saw that her fingers were stained with blood. It had been several hours since Mo Jingshan's back and head were smashed by the gun, but in the morning, the blood on his back had already dried and stuck to his shirt. However, the blood on his head had not dried yet. It was clear how badly he had been smashed. Mo Jingshan pressed down her blood-stained hand. His tone was calm. "It's all right. They're all external wounds. It'll be fine after we get them bandaged." Jinwan tried hard to hold back her tears. She did not want to become a burden in his heart. She sniffled and raised her eyes to look at him. She said calmly, "Feng Ling left the first aid kit here. I'll help you clean your wounds, all right?" Chapter 302. Jinwan was really not a woman who liked to cry. But when she forced Mo Jingshan to sit down and tore open his shirt, she saw that not only were there wounds on his back and head, but there were also faint wounds all over his body. At the same time, when she saw beads of blood slowly rolling down the back of his neck and head, her tears immediately fell with a patter. It turned out that those people didn't just lock him up there. Before the first day he was locked up, they must have tortured him. But Mo Jingshan was too difficult for them to control, so they were discouraged and simply locked him up like this, trying to find a way to get information out of his mouth. But in the end they still miscalculated. Mo Jingshan was about to push her hand away, but Jinwan stubbornly helped him take off his clothes. The blood on the back of his shirt had stuck to his back and could not be taken off smoothly. Jinwan carefully tore it. Although the man did not move, she looked forward and saw that Mo Jingshan had closed his eyes at this moment. It must still hurt. It could not hurt. How could it not hurt when the blood and flesh were torn off like this? Cry out if it hurts. Jinwan raised her hand to wipe her tears, wondering whether she should tear it off all at once or slowly, but the slower she did, the more painful it would be. It won't hurt if I cry out? The man's voice seemed to be carrying a faint smile, low and heavy, which could calm her down at any time. Jinwan suddenly got up, went to the bathroom in the cabin to get a clean towel, folded it into a square, took it out and handed it to him. Bite it first. Mo Jingshan glanced at her wet eyes and red nose, smiled slightly, reached out to take the towel but put it aside. At the same time he pulled Jinwan over, let her sit on his lap, held her and raised his hand to stroke her long hair. He looked at her eyes that never shed tears no matter how she was beaten and scolded in the camp. He looked at the little woman who was not afraid of death but now cried so much because of his wounds. The man's slender fingers ran through her hair and finally rested on her back, gently and slowly stroking. Nwan. The man's gentle and patient voice rang by her ear. Jinwan knew that she had lost her composure. She raised her hand to wipe her nose before raising her clear, slightly wet eyes to look at him. Pain is inevitable. I'm also human and I can feel pain, but this kind of pain on the surface of my skin can't compare to what I've experienced today. He caressed her back and warmly said, in this kind of place, after experiencing this kind of experience, people will instinctively understand the fragility of life. They will cherish the peace in front of them even more. Being able to keep their lives is already a blessing. These external injuries will recover after a period of treatment, but once a person's heart is hurt, it will only get deeper and deeper. Jinwan hugged his neck and buried her face in it, not speaking. Today you put yourself in danger and even wanted to use your body as a bargaining chip to ensure my safety. I don't want this to happen a second time ever. His hand was wrapped around her waist. Even though he hadn't eaten for many days, his hand was still firm and strong. She knew that at that time Mo Jingshan's emotions had been turned upside down. Jinwan obediently sat in his arms, softly making an end sound and did not refute. Right now he was an injured patient. Whatever he said was the truth. She would not argue with him, nor would she be stubborn with him. All right, it's just an external injury. Wipe your tears. The man patted her head again. Go get some warm water and wipe it down along the wound on my back. This way my clothes can be removed. Jinwan wiped her eyes and stood up to do as he said. She went to the bathroom to get some warm water. Just as she was about to continue treating his wounds, she hesitated. You're already injured like this. If you touch water, won't it be fine? Since it's already like this, there's no difference whether you touch water or not. Remove your clothes first and then disinfect them. Mo Jingshan remained calm. Compared to her flustered state, there was indeed a huge difference between a man and a woman's calmness and intelligence in the face of danger. Jinwan was about to touch the water when Mo Jingshan suddenly glanced at the gauze on her hand. Forget it. You can do it when we go back. Your hand can't do it. I'm fine. Feng Ling has already helped me. My right fingertip isn't injured. I only need to hold onto the towel here. Otherwise, do you want Feng Ling to come in and help you take off your clothes? Mo Jingshan glanced at her hand again. After confirming that she knew what she was doing, he did not speak again. Jinwan dipped the towel in the hot water and gently poured some on his back. She felt that the muscles on the man's back had only slightly tightened. Other than that, he did not make a sound. As he said, he was also human. He would also feel pain. Jinwan helped him moisten the wound bit by bit and then tore off the wet shirt bit by bit. This method could indeed prevent too much flesh and blood from being torn off. She then helped him wipe the area around the wound with water. After confirming that the blood had been wiped clean, she picked up the disinfectant to help him apply. Mo Jingshan, if it hurts, just bite the towel. Don't hold it in. It's not like I'll laugh at you. Earlier, when Feng Ling helped him apply the disinfectant to his hand, she was in so much pain that she broke out in cold sweat. However, she endured it and did not make a sound. How big of an injury was that? It was only scalded to the surface of his skin. Mo Jingshan's wound was deep within his flesh. The man did not speak, but she clearly heard him chuckle. Her heart ached for him, yet he was still in the mood to laugh. Jinwan's originally heavy heart suddenly calmed down due to his low chuckle. In the end, she did not hesitate and chose to quickly help him disinfect the wound. She then applied some simple medicine and took out some gauze from the medicine box. She wrapped it around his body, and in the end, his chest and back were wrapped like a heavily injured patient in an ancient television drama. It was almost as though he was wearing a white vest. I suddenly regret not studying medicine back then. Seeing that Mo Jingshan only lowered his head to take a look but did not say anything, Jinwan felt slightly embarrassed as she muttered. Mo Jingshan narrowed his eyes slightly and chuckled. He calmly said, "Regardless of whether you study medicine or finance, you don't need to use this kind of external bandaging. However, it's still more important to understand the difference between a first kiss and artificial respiration as soon as possible." Jinwan's hand that was helping him treat the wound on his head paused. She looked at him in surprise. "What artificial respiration?" The man chuckled again. "All right, now isn't the time to talk about this. Are you sure your hand is fine? It's not a problem. At the very least, I'll help you disinfect the wound first. Otherwise, it'll be easy to get infected in this tropical area." Jinwan continued to focus on applying medicine. However, earlier when he said something about a first kiss and artificial respiration. Chapter 303. She had just helped Mo Jingshan deal with the wound on his head when the cabin door opened once more. Feng Ling was about to enter when she saw that Mo Jingshan's black shirt had been tossed to the side. She paused and decisively took a step back. She did not enter but said from outside, "Mr. Mo, the commander of the American police force, Officer Entz, is looking for you." Jinwan rushed to hold him down. She did not wish for him to go out in his injured state. However, Mo Jingshan pressed down on her hand on his shoulder and patted it comfortingly. At the same time he said to the outside, "I understand." After speaking, he turned to glance at Jinwan. "Officer Entz and I used to be friends. This time he specially flew over from America to Cambodia. It's not as simple as a rescue mission. He has his own interests. Let's go talk. Rest here. Feng Ling will accompany you." Jinwan's hand left his body. "Where do we talk?" "Not far. The people in the center of the camp have already been restrained. The surrounding area has also been surrounded by the base personnel and the police. It's very safe. We're only going to talk on paper. There won't be any violence. We'll be back soon in?" He pinched her face. It was not easy to pull him back to her side, but there were still so many follow-up problems that required him to personally deal with them. He was clearly injured to this extent, yet he could not rest properly. Jinwan was unwilling, but she could not drag him along. She nodded. "All right." Mo Jingshan picked up the blood-stained black shirt. Jinwan was about to say that the shirt was covered in blood, but there were no other clothes he could wear here. Her words were stuck in her throat. Thankfully the shirt was black. If she did not know better, she would not have noticed the bloodstains. Mo Jingshan casually buttoned up a few buttons. Aside from the light stubble on his chin and his slightly paler complexion, he did not seem to have changed much. His body was covered in injuries, but he did not appear to be in a sorry state. In comparison, Jinwan's white sarong dress was too tragic to look at. She watched as the man walked out of the cabin door. Jinwan followed him, but before she could step out, she was blocked by Feng Ling. "Mrs. Mo, rest inside. Don't come out," Feng Ling said. Jinwan glanced at the camp not far away. The path she had walked for the past 2 days was covered in blood, and the gangsters lay motionless, covered in blood. The nausea in her stomach returned. She turned around and sat down in the cabin. It was indeed not suitable for her to go out. In the country, in high city, and in the peace society for too many years, this was the first time she had faced such chaos and killing. Looking at the ground covered in blood and different types of empty bullet casings, she was afraid that she would have nightmares for 2 years. Feng Ling dutifully guarded outside. After a while, she said a few words to the people outside the helicopter and then entered the cabin. "You're not going to sleep?" Feng Ling asked, seeing Jinwan's eyes were wide open. "A few hours ago I fell asleep when there was a series of gunshots. I slept for a few hours, so I don't feel sleepy now." Jinwan leaned against the wall of the cabin and said with emotion, "Feng Ling, I feel that these days, it's like watching a movie." Feng Ling chuckled. "How can you watch a movie with your hands full of injuries? At least he survived, didn't he? At least Mo Jingshan is safe." Jinwan turned to look at her. "That's true. These years I've been on missions in the base and seen too many deaths. Being alive is indeed more important than anything else. Whether it's an unexpected experience or a peaceful life, it's all fleeting. Perhaps, as you said, as long as some things are in the past, they're just a movie in life." Feng Ling smiled. Jinwan glanced at her again. "Past? Do you think the incident of taking contraceptives in T-City can be forgotten so easily? Just pretend that it never happened. Feng Ling immediately put on a serious face. For the past few days, Jinwan had not dared to smile. Now she laughed out loud and tilted her head to look at her. I'm really curious about how you and Nanheng came to be. You used to be brothers. What happened later? Feng Ling was expressionless. Now we're still brothers. Really? Jinwan curved her lips. Why do I feel that you treat him as a brother but he treats you as his woman? Mrs. Mo, did your hand get wet earlier? Feng Ling suddenly looked at her and stiffly changed the topic. Jinwan saw Feng Ling suddenly pick up the medicine box. Why don't I sterilize your hand again? Forget it. It hurts. Jinwan put her hand behind her back. She felt that every time Feng Ling encountered a topic related to Nanheng, she would not be so calm and even irritable. Forget it. She would not hurt her. Her own husband was not obediently resting with her. She could not even control her own man. How could she have the energy to care about Feng Ling's matters? But then again, if Mo Jingshan was like a towering ancient tree with deep roots in the soil, constantly sheltering her from the wind and rain, then perhaps Nanheng was like the wind. Not only was this kind of man unfathomable, but he was also so far away that it was hard to reach. With Feng Ling's personality, if she really became serious, who knew how badly she would be bullied? So, it was better for Feng Ling to continue following her. After about 2 hours it was already dark. Feng Ling went to get some dry bread and mineral water for Jinwan to fill her stomach. But Jinwan could not eat. Although the cabin door was closed, she could still smell the blood on the ground outside. Besides, Mo Jingshan had not eaten or drunk for so many days. He should not have eaten anything yet. How could she eat? Seeing Jinwan holding the dry bread in her hand but staring at the gauze in her hand, Feng Ling knew that she needed some time to calm down. After all, the experience these days should be unforgettable. Feng Ling did not speak. She opened the door, got off the plane, and went outside to check on the injuries of the other brothers in the base. It was not until the surrounding dense forest was filled with the exclusive sounds of insects at night because of the darkness that Mo Jingshan finally returned. Mo Jingshan entered the cabin door, saw the undamaged bread and unopened mineral water in Jinwan's hands, and asked her, "Why don't you eat?" Hearing his voice, Jinwan abruptly returned to herself. She stood up and held the two things in her hands toward him. "For you." Mo Jingshan stared at her for a long moment before slowly smiling. He walked over and brought the little woman who was looking forward to him eating into his arms. "I've already drunk some water in the afternoon and had a simple meal. I'm not hungry right now." Chapter 304. After that, I don't feel hungry anymore. I can't eat too much at once or my stomach won't be able to take it. Tomorrow I'll go back to eating normally. Be good and eat. Don't worry about me. As Mo Jingshan spoke, he touched her slightly ashen face. Right now you have to eat 2 people's meals. These days you haven't even had enough nutrition. Now you can't even bear to eat bread. Those who don't know might think that I bullied Mrs. Mo. Jinwan buried her face in his chest. Thankfully, your most serious injuries are on your back. Otherwise, I wouldn't even be able to lean against your arms. Because 11 Base had wounded people who had jumped down from the helicopter and been shot at, they quickly flew out of the dense forest after cooperating with the police to take photos and collect evidence. The injured people's conditions were not stable. Thankfully, 11 Base had a doctor with them. When the plane landed, Jinwan learned that in order to take care of the injured people, they had to rest in the previous warehouse and bulletproof shed for the night. After their injuries stabilized, they would be sent back to America for better treatment. Jinwan had stayed here for 2 days and was not unfamiliar with it. However, as soon as Mo Jingshan arrived, he did not stop and directly went out with Nanheng. Late at night, Jinwan took out the phone that Feng Ling had kept for her and glanced at the time. It was almost midnight. Injured to this extent, he still didn't rest and still had things to discuss so late at night. Did he not want his wife or his life anymore? Not long after, when Mo Jingshan entered Jinwan's cubicle, he saw that the little woman's face was unhappy. "What's wrong?" "Nothing. I was too busy looking at my phone earlier and forgot the time. I'm going to change. You go out first." Jinwan did not look at him. Seeing that this little woman actually gave him an unpleasant look, Mo Jingshan glanced at her clothes. It was a local white dress that Feng Ling had specially bought from the farm across the Tunnel Sap Lake. It was more fitting than the one Jinwan was wearing. The style was not too plain and was more suitable for young people. He smiled faintly. "Chains?" Jinwan had yet to realize what his playful expression meant and stood up to push him out. "Go out." Why should I go out? Not only do I need to change, I also need to shower. Jinwan pointed to the bucket of hot water in the room. I haven't showered for days. It's so smelly. Originally, she had planned to wait for Mo Jingshan to come back so that he could shower first. Yet, it took so long for him to come back. She had a stomach full of anger. Let's not talk about the fact that there's no need for me to go out when you shower. Mo Jingshan's thin lips held in a smile. He purposely glanced at her hand that had been wrapped up like a dumpling by the base doctor. Jinwan. In the afternoon, the bandage Feng Ling helped her bandage wasn't so thick or tight. At that time, her fingers could still move. T. T to say T, I, T, T. The. G and T, T to, T, to. T, T. Her heart tightened. The moment she opened the door, the man's long arm reached out and closed it. Jinwan turned to look at him. In such a peaceful night, although the smell of blood on his body had faded, the two of them were injured. Their gazes met. Seeing his ink-black eyes, her heart suddenly tightened. Why don't you shower first? He glanced at her hands and directly lifted his hand to strip her dress from her shoulders down. Jinwan, although the man's back and head were injured, it did not affect his hands. He took it off naturally as though he was peeling an orange. In the blink of an eye, Jinwan's almost white dress was peeled off. It's not like I haven't helped you shower before. Are you embarrassed now? After taking off her clothes, the man's tone was light. He then glanced at the wooden bucket over there. This way of bathing is really primitive. Even if I help you wash such a small wooden bucket, I don't have the extra space to do anything to you. Jinwan, even if there's space, you can't do anything to me now. You're not allowed to do anything in the first 3 months of pregnancy. Mo Jingshan raised his eyebrows and looked at her deeply. Did Qin Siding tell you this? No, when I was looking at my phone, I read some common knowledge about pregnancy. You're very timely. Otherwise, what do you want to do with your injuries? You haven't eaten for several days. Do you think your stamina is endless? Stamina depends on what it is. Jinwan, sitting in this small wooden tub, Jinwan was a bit absent-minded. This kind of primitive bathing method made her wonder what kind of life the local people in Cambodia lived. When she left the airport, she saw many modern buildings and many fashionable people passing by. Their lives were also very peaceful. But in these villages near Tunnel Sap Lake, the way of life was probably very different from that in the city. Seeing Mo Jingshan roll up his sleeves and come over, Jinwan looked at the man's face through the mist and suddenly said, "Why don't you let Feng Ling help me wash?" When saying this, she actually hesitated. Although she and Feng Ling were both women, they had never been naked. If Feng Ling really came, perhaps it would also be awkward. She really didn't like others touching her. She was only used to Mo Jingshan. But Mo Jingshan's injuries were much more serious than hers. The man's hand had already reached into the water. He tested the water temperature and then swept the water over her exposed shoulder. His tone was still light. I don't allow others to touch you, not men, not even Feng Ling, who can switch between men and women. What did he mean by switch between men and women? Feng Ling had only been pretending to be a man in the base. She was clearly a woman inside and out. But since things had already come to this, Jinwan didn't say anything more. She leaned against the wooden bucket, allowing the man's hand to help her bathe. She said, "By the way, I might not have a chance to go back to the condo next to T University. Should I sell it or—" Before she could finish speaking, she suddenly felt her vision darken. She opened her eyes to see that the man had lowered his head. His cool, pleasant scent drowned her senses. Her breath was immediately filled with his scent. She was startled. "What are you doing?" The man raised her chin with his fingers. He looked at her cheeks that had become much thinner and said hoarsely, "Wait a moment before bathing. Let's kiss for a while first." Chapter 305. He said he would kiss for a while longer, but once they started, it was almost impossible to stop. Jinwan pushed him away symbolically. Usually she couldn't push him away. Now that her hands were wrapped up, she couldn't move at all. Their lips and teeth intertwined. She closed her eyes and the man's arms held her armpits, almost carrying her out of the water. Jinwan still remembered the injury on his back. Right now he definitely couldn't push his arms forward like this. She subconsciously moved back and her bright red lips moved. "Don't. You're injured." Even though she ended the long kiss before it got out of hand, when she spoke, her face was still flushed, and she looked even more charming in the steam rising from her face. Mo Jingshan planted a kiss on the corner of her lips, then on her cheeks and finally on her ears. His clear, low and husky voice was very, very gentle. Do you know what I was thinking when you suddenly knelt before me that day? What were you thinking? I wanted to fly back to High City immediately. I'd rather have you kneel in bed with your back facing me and beg for mercy than see you kneel before me in that way. When Mo Jingshan finished speaking, he suddenly bit her fair ear. Jin Wan shivered in pain and then heard the man say hoarsely, "You knew I was trying my best to bear it, yet you still dared to kneel. You did it on purpose, en?" Jin Wan shrank her neck in the water. She felt the man's pressure pressing against her, and she was almost squeezed into this small wooden bucket. "I knew you hadn't eaten or drunk anything for several days, and I was afraid your body wouldn't be able to take it. I was too anxious and those people kept staring at me. If I didn't pretend to be too helpless, I might have been shot in the head at any time. I still have to live and soar together with you. I don't want to die." Jin Wan's voice became softer and softer, until it became a soft murmur. He stared at her and did not speak. His hand touched the back of her head, pausing on her black hair. Jin Wan's heart swelled under his gaze. "Mo Jingshan, en?" She pursed her lips, and her tone carried a hint of lingering fear. "They said you haven't been involved in the underworld, so after this, can we directly return to High City? Or do you want to return to America with Nanhang and the others?" The man looked at her face under her long hair and smiled. He touched her wet hair. "Do you want to go back to High City? It's still more comfortable at home. I might need some time to digest and forget what happened in the past few days. I'm afraid the baby in my tummy won't be able to take it if I keep feeling so nervous." As she spoke, she gently stroked her flat belly with her hand that had been submerged in the water. Mo Jingshan's gaze was gentle. Watching her movements underwater, his lips curved up slightly. "All right. Once this matter is settled, we'll return to High City. Okay, I'll bathe for a while." "You don't have to help me. Just soak in the water for a while. I'll help you when you bathe." Mo Jingshan made an sound, turning to pick up the clean white dress she had placed on the bed, placing it by the side. After the bath she came out of the wooden tub. Perhaps it was because she hadn't had such intimate contact in a long time, or perhaps it was because she had just experienced a life and death situation, but she felt a little embarrassed to have this familiar yet strange man help her bathe. Thus, when Mo Jingshan was about to help her put on the dress, Jin Wan looked at him with a bashful expression. "Can't you close your eyes?" Mo Jingshan glanced at her cheeks, which were red from being soaked in the hot water or because of a moment of shyness. "No." Jin Wan, very good. He had just returned and he had regained his rights as a husband. After a few seconds of stalemate, Jin Wan compromised and raised her arm. When the man helped her put on the dress, to relieve the awkwardness of standing naked before him, Jin Wan cleared her throat. "Don't you think I've gained a little weight?" Mo Jingshan was helping her tie the white ribbon in front of her dress. His slender fingers shuffled through the ribbon, his voice mild. "After these days of struggle you've clearly lost weight. How could you have gained weight?" "But I'm pregnant. Anyone who is pregnant will gain weight." The man helped her tie the ribbon and raised his hand to push her long hair behind her back. There was no hairdryer here, so she could only let it dry naturally. At the same time, because of her words, he carefully looked at her from head to toe and finally commented, "You've lost at least 5 pounds. She said she was fat, but he insisted on saying she was thin. "Also, who told you that pregnant people will definitely gain weight? How long have you been pregnant? Your belly will only be visible after at least 2 months. There won't be any changes to your figure." "How did you know? Have you read any pregnancy-related books?" Mo Jingshan glanced at the little woman who suddenly leaned into his arms. She had just bathed and her cheeks were still slightly red. His Adam's apple moved. He stared at the side of her face. Under the light in the cubicle, he could clearly see her thick, long eyelashes and the warm, clear outline of her cheeks. 2 months ago, when Auntie Chin had nothing to do, she would always talk about these things by my side, asking me to pay attention to whether you were pregnant or not. She was worried that there would be no one to take care of you in T-City, so she would often nag at me after I got off work and returned to the U Garden. The man's voice was mild and hoarse. "Ha, grandfather and Auntie Chin together are like a large army. A captain and a deputy captain." She watched as Mo Jingshan, dressed in a blood-stained black shirt and filled with a dispirited and cold aura, transformed back into a clean white t-shirt President Mo. Jin Wan sat on the bed watching the man clean his stubble and was almost dazed. Most adult men would grow stubble if they did not shave for a day or two. In the past, Mo Jingshan had always been clean like this. His image was good and his aura was excellent. Whenever he stood there he would be a scenery. However, his unkempt appearance these days gave off a different feeling. It was not ugly, and it could even move the tiny bit of worship and excitement hidden in a woman's heart. He was especially good-looking and attractive. However, she quickly returned to her senses. Earlier, when she was helping him bathe, she saw that the wound on his back needed to be treated by the base doctor again. Thus, she quickly kept the blood-stained black shirt on the ground. Thankfully, Nan Heng's figure is similar to yours. His t-shirt doesn't look out of place on you at all. However, when Jin Wan walked past him, she spoke with a young maiden's heart pounding, "You look much more approachable in a t-shirt than in a shirt." Chapter 306. Hearing this, Mo Jingshan gave her a meaningful look. She put away the red hearts that were about to pop out of her eyes, turned around, and walked out quickly with his clothes in her arms. At the same time, she went to look for the base doctor who had just gotten free and asked him to help disinfect and apply medicine to Mo Jingshan's wounds. The base doctor had just come over from the more seriously injured patients and was about to come to see Mr. Mo. Seeing Mrs. Mo come out, he nodded politely to Jin Wan and walked straight inside. "Are you feeling refreshed after taking a shower, changing your clothes, and seeing your man return safely? Even when you walk, you look like you're floating." A voice came from outside the door. It was cold and indifferent, with a hint of mockery. Jin Wan looked sideways and saw the figure standing in front of the door with a cigarette in his mouth. She saw Nan Heng take the cigarette out of his mouth and narrowed his eyes coldly at her. "I've been nervous for a few days and I've just relaxed a little. Can't you let me get carried away?" She laughed. Nan Heng snorted. "My t-shirt is new and I haven't worn it yet. It should fit your man, right?" "It fits quite well. Both of you are 188 meters tall," Jin Wan casually replied. "As long as it fits." Nan Heng glanced at her again. "But in this base only you and Feng Ling are women. Feng Ling is a little taller than you, and she only has the base's combat uniform. It's not suitable for you to wear it, so we can only buy this kind of skirt." Jin Wan tugged at the hem of her dress. "I look good too. It's rare for me to wear such a loose dress. It's quite ethnic. I didn't realize it in the past, but Miss Ji has really become more and more easygoing. Compared to her arrogant self in the past, it's been especially obvious in the past few days." This Nan Heng really wanted to diss her for no reason at all. Jin Wan was used to it. She only smiled and did not say much. She was about to take the black shirt out when Nan Heng glanced at it, asking, "Are you going to wash this?" "Yeah. It's covered in blood and the back is damaged in many places. I can't wear it even if I wash it. What's the point of washing it?" "Wash it and bring it back. It's good to keep it as a souvenir." Nan Heng sneered and looked at her as if she was crazy. "Commemorate what? To commemorate the life and death of your man? Or to commemorate the bloody scene in this broken place?" These words really made people lose their appetites. Jin Wan pursed her lips and was hesitating whether she should throw the shirt away. All of a sudden, Nan Heng seemed to recall something. He glanced at her and asked, "You didn't tell him that you washed our socks for us, did you?" "No." Jin Wan had yet to finish when she suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's voice behind her. "What do you mean by washing socks?" "Jin Wan, Nan Heng." Nan Heng narrowed his eyes and took a puff of his cigarette. Then he threw the cigarette butt on the ground and stepped on it to extinguish it. He said indifferently, "Akib and Dali are still in the jungle, and there's always a team of people protecting them. The hidden position should be the ambush point that they had set up before entering, and they're just waiting for us to go over. But it's useless even if they manage to escape for one night. Tomorrow morning, Officer Entz and I will go in and search again to see if they've already been blown up by the minefield. Rest well." Before Mo Jingshan could speak, Jin Wan turned to look at him. "Didn't the base doctor go in earlier? Why did you come out without treating your wound?" "The doctor is currently preparing medicine. He'll return in 5 minutes to apply the medicine." Mo Jingshan looked at her and then at the shirt in her hands. "Throw it away." Jin Wan thought about it and agreed. This shirt was not only stained with Mo Jingshan's blood, but also those people's blood. Thinking that those people were almost all dead by now, she felt a chill run down her spine and decisively threw the clothes away. Nan Heng suddenly clicked his tongue. "I asked you to throw it away but you didn't. You even said that you wanted to keep it as a souvenir. Your man just casually said 3 words and you threw it away?" "That's right. Otherwise, why would he be my man?" Jin Wan glanced at him and then smiled at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan's expression did not change, but it was clear that his mood was good because of Jin Wan's words. The corners of his lips turned up slightly. Nan Heng smiled insincerely. "You're just forcing dog food on people. I really wonder if there's anyone who can coexist peacefully in front of you. There is. Feng Ling is very calm. Jin Wan glanced at him indifferently. And no matter how I show off my love, Feng Ling's heart is unmoved. She doesn't even seem to have any interest in things like love and men. Nanheng. That night, Jin Wan was finally able to sleep peacefully by Mo Jingshan's side. However, in her dreams she held onto his hand tightly and did not let go. It was only when the sky was about to brighten that her fingers gradually loosened due to her deep sleep. After the storm of the past few days, Jin Wan was very sensitive here. However, because Mo Jingshan was by her side, she could finally sleep peacefully. However, she was still afraid that if anything happened, he would suddenly disappear from her sight. After a night of peaceful sleep, they slept peacefully. Early in the morning, Jin Wan turned over. In this kind of warehouse, every cubicle was occupied. The conditions were not very good. The environment was too stuffy. There were no windows or air conditioning. There was only a small fan on the ground, blowing against the bed and causing the bedsheets to sway. Her hand was slightly cold. She did not touch Mo Jingshan. Jin Wan subconsciously opened her eyes and glanced to the side. As expected, he was not there. Jin Wan panicked and rushed to get off the bed. However, because the cubicle was too small and the fan was too close, her foot tripped over the electric wire. Her entire body fell to the ground. Thankfully, her hands were fast and she pressed against the side of the bed. She did not fall too badly and only knelt heavily on the ground. Due to the electric wire being kicked down, the fan stopped working and fell to the ground. Jin Wan hissed in pain. She staggered and was about to stand up with the support of the bed when the cubicle door was suddenly pushed open. Hearing the sound, Mo Jingshan, who had rushed over, saw Jin Wan half kneeling on the ground and immediately came over to help her up. Why did you fall? Didn't you notice the electric wire on the ground? Seeing that he was still fine, Jin Wan momentarily forgot about the pain in her knee. She released a long breath. I saw that you weren't here and thought you. She paused and glanced at the electric wire on the ground. She pursed her lips and said, I'll be more careful next time. I won't be so careless in the future. Knowing that she was still a little scared, Mo Jingshan did not expose her brave armor. He held her hand and glanced at the bandaged area. Remember to change your dressing today. It's not good to keep your hand bandaged in a tropical area like this. Tell the base doctor to pay more attention. Don't overlook your hand injury. Chapter 307. Mo Jingshan knew that Jin Wan would be more sensible in such an environment. She knew her limits. She did not wish to cause trouble for others, so he did not say more. He pinched her sleepy little face. Go wash up and eat something. At this moment, someone called out to him from outside. It sounded like someone was calling, Mr. Mo. He glanced at Jin Wan. Seeing that she had already turned to retrieve the toothbrush and toothpaste Feng Ling had prepared for her, he turned to leave. Jin Wan left the warehouse and was brushing her teeth against the grass by the side when she suddenly heard a loud noise from the forest. It was deafening, causing her hands to tremble. Mo Jingshan had just brought her a bowl of porridge when he heard the noise. He placed the things in his hands down and headed toward the forest. Jin Wan wanted to call out to him, but her mouth was stuffed with the toothbrush. The white foam stuck to the corner of her lips. She rushed to rinse her mouth with water. By the time she turned back, Mo Jingshan had already walked far away. Mrs. Mo, don't go over. Seeing that Jin Wan was about to follow, Feng Ling rushed over to press her shoulder. A large area of the forest has been detonated. There will be a series of explosions. You don't have to worry. Then what are they going to do? Jin Wan's intuition told her that Mo Jingshan's gaze had suddenly darkened. Something must have happened. Then she saw more than 20 people in the base rushing toward the dense forest. They were all dressed in black, with knives and guns at their waists. They looked serious, and the people in front were also wearing bulletproof vests and explosion-proof shields. This scene looked as serious and tense as yesterday in the hinterland of the camp. Nanheng was nowhere to be found. The leader of the group was currently giving out orders. Jin Wan asked, did something happen inside? Last night, I heard that their leader, the one named Akib, escaped? He escaped, but they won't be able to escape from this forest. Feng Ling tried her best not to hide anything from Jin Wan to prevent her imagination from running wild. She directly said, but I didn't expect Akib to be so scheming. They had already kidnapped 8 children from the village on the other side of Tunnel Sap Lake and locked them near a minefield behind the forest. Right now they can't escape, but they are using the lives of those innocent children to threaten us, demanding that we let them leave the forest safely. Otherwise those children will... 8 children? Jinwan frowned. Yes, the average age of those children is less than 6 years old, and they've been locked up for a few days. We don't know how they're doing for the time being, but Nanheng just sent a message saying that a child accidentally ran into a minefield in order to escape, causing the entire minefield to explode. What about the child? Dead. Feng Ling's voice was heavy. 1 dead. 7 left. The average age of these children was less than 6 years old. How deranged were these people? They actually captured so many children to be his escape plan. A group of innocent children had been implicated because of their conflict with Akib's group. They did have the responsibility to save those children. While Jinwan was thinking, Mo Jingshan had already returned. His gaze swept past her and landed on Feng Ling. Finally he looked at Jinwan. Wash up and go eat. Seeing his expression, Jinwan asked, Are you going in with them? Yes. But you are still injured. Don't move. Besides, Nanheng and the people from the base, including Officer Entz, are enough. There's no need for you to go. Akib's target is me. Jinwan's voice was immediately choked in her throat. She wanted to speak, but right now he no longer had the time to speak. He only indicated for Feng Ling to bring Jinwan back to the room in the warehouse. Jinwan's voice was tense. You are injured? Mo Jingshan glanced at her. Soon those children will lose their lives. Jinwan's ears suddenly rang with the sound of the explosion. Thinking of the scene of those innocent children being blown to death, she felt as though all the blood in her body was flowing backwards. She found it difficult to breathe. Although she knew that those innocent children were implicated because of them, although she knew that Mo Jingshan would not sit back and watch. But there was still a selfish corner of her heart that wanted her to open her mouth and beg him not to go. After a pause, Jinwan said, I'll go with you. You stay here? He decisively cut her off. Feng Ling, watch over her. But you're injured like this. If I go with you, I might still be able to. You stay here obediently. You're not allowed to go anywhere. These few words were unprecedentedly stern. Mo Jingshan expressionlessly stared at Jinwan. It was almost an order. Jinwan froze in her spot and did not move. Mo Jingshan gave Feng Ling a look. Feng Ling directly went to hold Jinwan's hand. Jinwan opened her mouth to say something, but in the end she could only close it. She could not say a single word. Mo Jingshan turned toward the group of people. After taking several steps, he suddenly tilted his head to the side. Stay here well. Don't get hurt. It had been more than an hour since Mo Jingshan and the others flew into the forest on the helicopter. A series of explosions rang out. It was unknown where the landmines had been stepped on, but it was also unknown which side had opened fire. Here, Jinwan could only hear the various sounds of explosions in the forest. She could not hear anything else. She ran out of the warehouse uncontrollably and looked inside. Feng Ling was also relatively silent. She did not comfort or persuade her as she usually would. It was clear that Akib had set up an ambush near the dangerous minefield. This was not an ambush but an unavoidable ground full of bombs. No matter how powerful a person was, it was very likely that they would not be able to withstand this kind of danger. The person Jinwan was most worried about was Mo Jingshan. And the person Feng Ling had to worry about, aside from Mr. Mo, was also Nanheng and the group of brothers who had gone through life and death with her. Jinwan recalled that before Mo Jingshan went to sleep yesterday, he had helped her switch the electric fan to the lowest setting. When she straightened her back, her body trembled in pain and she almost fell. In this state, if he went in, how was he going to save those children? She suddenly turned to Feng Ling. The person you care about the most is here. Would you rather go in with him? Even if you die together with him, it's still better than worrying alone outside? Feng Ling paused. Obviously, Jinwan's words had hit her heart, but she still said mildly, Mr. Mo said that I must watch over you. You can't go anywhere. Jinwan looked at a small helicopter parked not far away and then at the key on Feng Ling's waist. She suddenly curved her lips and said meaningfully, I'm quite good at driving. I've always been good at controlling the direction. I heard that this kind of helicopter is not as complicated as a commercial plane. Tell me, can I drive it? Mrs. Mo, don't be impulsive. Feng Ling, my man is there. No. Chapter 308. The location of the incident was the minefield in the forest closest to Tunnel Sap Lake. Dali and several of his subordinates had escorted Akib here. They had already abducted the children from the nearby farms. Indeed, as Feng Ling had said, of the 8 children, 1 had already died. When the explosion rang out, the 7 young children watched in horror and confusion as their little friend was suddenly thrown into the air by the explosion. Blood splattered everywhere and he fell to the ground like a piece of charred wood. They were clearly little friends who had grown up together. A few days ago they had even played and laughed together. Today he was lying in the charred flames. His entire body was black and blood was dripping from his body. He was motionless. The police asked them to let the children go and they could negotiate. However, Akip's only condition was for Mo Jingshan to personally talk to them. Rather than talk to them face to face, it would be more accurate to say that the 7 children's bargaining chips were not big. Their biggest bargaining chip was still Mo Jingshan. Either they used Mo Jingshan to exchange for the 7 children's lives, or these 7 children would accompany them to be buried in this minefield. Furthermore, there were already fuses buried near the minefield. If they could not come to an agreement, none of the people who entered this area would be able to escape. The entire forest would explode one after another, and the area several miles around Tunnel Sap Lake would be affected by the explosion. When Jin Wan and Feng Ling rushed to the scene, the police and 11 base members that ENCE had brought along had already set up a cordon. The minefield was separated from the safe zone. Akib, Dolly, and the others were already surrounded. However, because the 7 children's lives were in their hands, they could not charge in recklessly. Officer ENCE did not approach to question them when he saw that they were people brought by Feng Ling. Right now he did not have the time to deal with anyone. He even angrily pushed away his subordinates who were whispering suggestions to him. He only watched the 7 frightened children as he racked his brains to think of a solution. Officer ENCE looked at Feng Ling and Feng Ling. Jin Wan did not go over to disturb the officer. She saw that their helicopters were parked behind, and she did not see Mo Jingshan. She felt uneasy and approached the people from 11 base, attempting to gather information. After asking for a long time, the answer she finally came up with was this. One of the children had indeed died, and the remaining 7 might not be able to be rescued at all. However, they could not just give up on these innocent children. When the Cambodian local police heard the news, they said that they would immediately arrange for reinforcements. However, they had not arrived yet. It was likely that they were waiting for the minefields to be detonated before coming over to deal with the aftermath. The 7 children were covered in blood. Over the past few days they had either been beaten or scolded. Some who had fainted from hunger had been beaten awake by them. Now these children were forced to stay by Akip's side. No matter what they did, they would hurt the children. The child who had been killed in the explosion was only 6 years old. He had been making too much noise and had tried to escape. In the end, he had stepped into a minefield and been shot by Akip's men. Outside the cordon, Jin Wan couldn't see the specific situation inside, nor could she see Akip's group. But just by listening, Jin Wan already had a clear and shocking picture in her mind. On the other side, Mo Jingshan calmly watched the people guarding the cabin door. These people were all Nanhang's subordinates. They had been guarding outside the cabin door for a long time, preventing him from personally appearing at Akip's side. Around the helicopter, in the depths of the forest, there were lush greenery everywhere. The originally peaceful environment was now charred black and filled with an austere atmosphere. In the dense forest surrounded by layers of police, Akip's group could vaguely be seen moving about. Due to the safety of the children, no one dared to charge in. Nanhang. Mo Jingshan glanced at Nanhang who had just returned. Have your men retreat. Before Nanhang could speak at this moment, the surrounding police suddenly retreated in large numbers. From a small circle to a larger circle, their footsteps were hurried and urgent. The reason was that one of the children had suddenly rushed out. He ran alone and the others frantically followed him. The 7 children's cries were filled with fear and misery. Akip's men directly raised their guns and fired several shots into the air. The group of children were frightened into kneeling on the ground and did not dare to move. The scene was extremely chaotic. In an instant, they pulled the children back and mercilessly pressed the muzzle of the gun against their heads. The children were crying. The police kept shouting, attempting to pacify the children and the furious Akip's subordinates. Akip's men were shouting for the children to squat down and not allow them to run around. The children were so frightened that their bodies trembled as they squatted down. Their small bodies were curled into a ball, covered in dirt and blood. Those people were still talking to Officer ENCE. Officer ENCE looked at the children's frightened and despairing eyes and gestured for the surrounding people to retreat further, step by step. The helicopter that Mo Jingshan was in was less than 10 meters away from them. The cabin door was tightly guarded by Nanhang's men. Just as those people raised their guns to the children's heads and pulled the trigger, Mo Jingshan did not think twice and directly went down the cabin door to go over. He did not know that Jin Wan was already not far behind the helicopter. He did not know that the scene of him walking out of the helicopter had entered her eyes. Thus, when Akib's impatient gunshot was aimed at one of the children's legs, Jinwan saw Mo Jingshan abruptly push aside the group of people blocking in front of him. She only heard the gunshot. From her position she could only see Mo Jingshan's figure flash by. However, with just a quick glance, Jinwan also saw that the back of his white t-shirt had already begun to bleed. He must have used too much force when he pushed those people away. The wound on his back could not be easily pulled, so it must have opened up again. The wound had just been treated by the base doctor last night. Right now, it must have worsened again. Officer Entz was currently holding a walkie-talkie to speak with Nanheng's men. 11 base's people were able to receive the information and make a decision in time. Jinwan could not approach, but by listening she roughly understood the situation inside. For example, a child's calf had been pierced by a bullet, and the ground was covered in blood. The group of children was scared silly. They did not even dare to cry. They all squatted there like mutes, staring in horror at the blood slowly flowing past their feet. Another example was that Akib's feet should be the spot where they had set up an ambush to detonate the minefield. If they did not let them leave or if they did not allow Mo Jingshan to talk to him face to face, he would immediately detonate the minefield and bring the hundreds of people here down with him. Chapter 309. Looking at the child whose legs were crippled, the crowd was silent. No one spoke, but the 11 base's men's hands tightened on their guns. Akib was truly impatient. From the start, he had already prepared for the worst. He pointed his gun at the children's backs, his feet moving slowly on the ground. The moment the police dared to make a move, he could instantly detonate the bomb here. Not a single one of them could live. The crowd watched this scene. Only Jinwan did not. As the crowd continued to retreat, she could finally see Mo Jingshan through the gaps in the crowd. She stared at Mo Jingshan. Everyone was retreating except for him, who was moving forward. When Mo Jingshan's figure finally appeared, Akib's raging expression finally calmed down. "Mr. Mo." Officer Entz was about to step forward to stop him but was stopped by Mo Jingshan's slightly raised arm. "I'll go over." Mo Jingshan's tone was mild. Nanheng, who stood by the side, knew that he could not stop him at this time. He gave the brothers in the base a look and everyone raised their guns, preparing to move at any moment. However, the two sides were in a deadlock. Neither side dared to move. Mo Jingshan's appearance attracted the attention of everyone on Akib's side. Jinwan watched as Mo Jingshan walked into the danger zone. She glanced at the surrounding people and carefully hid behind the crowd. Behind this circle of people, there was a person slowly moving his feet bit by bit. Akib's men's attention was focused on Mo Jingshan, Officer Entz, and Nanheng. As long as they did not make any suspicious movements or commands, it meant that they were temporarily safe. Without their orders, no one dared to make a move. Just as Feng Ling, who had arrived at the last moment, was preparing to sneak an attack, she saw that Jinwan had already walked around the crowd. Her expression faltered. She wanted to rush over but she could not make any movements right now. She softened her footsteps and chased after her. While everyone was watching Mo Jingshan's footsteps, Akib glanced at Dolly. Dolly sneered. He was already prepared to use Mo Jingshan as the final bargaining chip to save his life. However, they did not notice that there was someone behind them. All of the police officers were still moving backward. Akib saw that Mo Jingshan was about to enter his reach and was about to blurt out the conditions he had prepared for the negotiation. He did not notice anything strange. It was at this moment that Mo Jingshan and Nanheng noticed the white figure at the back of the crowd. As Mo Jingshan's footsteps abruptly paused, Nanheng suddenly raised his hand. Bang! A gunshot rang out. Nanheng fired a shot toward the sky. Just as Akib and the others' attention was diverted and Akib was about to raise his gun to aim at Mo Jingshan, another unexpected gunshot rang out from behind. Bang! It was not as heavy as Nanheng's spear, but it tore through the air almost imperceptibly. Before Akib could react when he heard the sound, he was suddenly shot in the shoulder. His hand that was holding the gun lost its balance and he swayed forward. At this critical moment, Nanheng and Officer Entz each fired at Akib and his men's heads. Because Akib and his men were too shrewd, they had calculated their numbers from the start. Each person's position was closely watched by them, and they were unable to successfully sneak past them. They planned to strike first. This shot that no one expected had indeed opened the door for them to strike first. Feng Ling had already rushed over. Feng Ling rushed over and stared in disbelief at Jinwan, who had just fired a shot. She abruptly stepped forward, pressed her hand down, and dragged her to hide behind a tree to avoid being shot by Akib's men. At the same time, she glanced at the gun in Jinwan's hand. "Mrs. Mo, why do you have a gun?" Jinwan had yet to recover from the shock of actually being able to fire a shot. She stared blankly at Feng Ling before slowly returning to her senses. "Yesterday Jing Shin placed a gun in my sleeve. Earlier on, before you and I rushed over, I brought it with me. But I didn't expect that I would really be able to use it." Seeing Jinwan's dazed expression, Feng Ling held back her laughter and said, "Good job." At the same time, Feng Ling directly took the gun. She fiddled with it for a moment before handing it back to her. "Put it away. I'll put the trigger back in. Don't accidentally hurt yourself." Jinwan recalled how she had fired the gun earlier. She was truly dazed and suddenly felt a little terrified. "Forget it, I'll just not hold it. Before we leave Cambodia, keep it on you for self-defense." Without another word, Feng Ling placed the gun back into her sleeve. She then pulled Jinwan and turned to leave. "Come with me first. It's not safe here." At this moment, a loud shout suddenly came from the crowd. A police officer who had just surrounded them shouted in English, "Dolly has a bomb on him. He's going to launch a suicide attack." However, there was a limit to how fast a person could react. By the time everyone realized what was going on, when everyone's guns were pointed at them, no one dared to fire at Dolly. Everyone was moving at a high speed. It was impossible to aim 100%. Once someone shot Dolly, no one dared to imagine what would happen. After all, there were bombs below them and they were surrounded by minefields. Dolly also had a bomb on him. But could they just let Dolly jump into the crowd and cause the first explosion? In that instant, Mo Jingshin, who was being held back by the police and was only a few meters away from Dolly, pushed the crowd aside. Dolly sneered and raised his gun to shoot himself. In an instant that no one expected, the white figure suddenly pounced toward him. Dolly was about to shoot himself. Dolly, who was standing several meters away from Mo Jingshin, suddenly threw himself at him. Moreover, he succeeded in pressing Dolly under his body. Unexpectedly, Mo Jingshin, who was injured and had been protected by the police, suddenly came over. Dolly was knocked to the ground and the gun in his hand fell to the ground. It slipped out of his hand and slid forward a few meters. He hurriedly reached out to grab it back, but the person on his back held him down. Dolly simply turned around and wrestled with the person on his back. Was Mo Jingshin. Behind the crowd, Jinwan was being dragged away by Feng Ling. When she saw the scene inside, she almost screamed out loud. Dolly's body was tied with a bomb. Mo Jingshin's upper body was dressed in white, and a large patch of blood had already seeped out of his back. The police watched this scene in shock. For several seconds, no one dared to step forward. Only the people from 11 Base were about to rush in to save Mr. Mo but were warned by Officer Ensa's men not to go over. The bomb on Dolly's body could explode at any moment due to the scuffle. Chapter 310. Nan Hung could not stand Officer Ensa's cautious personality. Without thinking, he abruptly pulled out his gun and fired at Dolly's leg. At the same time as his gunshot, another gunshot rang out. It was Feng Ling who was standing by Jinwan's side. She had fired accurately and moved at the same frequency as him. The bullet also struck Dolly's other leg at the same time. Dolly's face contorted in pain. He was still half a meter away from the gun on the ground, but he still had to struggle to reach it. Mo Jingshin endured the pain and stood up, rushing forward. Meanwhile, Dolly was still crawling on the ground. The moment Mo Jingshin picked up the gun, his gaze shifted. He only hesitated for half a second before pulling the trigger and aiming it at Dolly's forehead. Nan Heng furrowed his brows and abruptly leaped forward. A sound. Nan Heng's shot directly struck Dolly's forehead. Another sound. Another hit. Another sound. It was Mo Jingshin who had accurately shot Dolly in the middle of his forehead when he was about to die with his eyes wide open. Dolly's eyes instantly closed. He was completely dead. Fresh blood flowed down the grass beneath him. You. Nan Heng's hand stiffened. His gaze was astonished. Back then, Mo Jingshin had promised Elder Mo that he would not involve himself in the underworld, would not stain his hands with blood, and would not take human lives. But no matter how Nan Heng tried to stop him, he still killed Dolly with his own hands. Mo Jingshin did not explain. As he tossed the gun aside, his gaze coldly stared at the dead man on the ground. His tone was mild. Come and defuse the bomb. Don't waste words. Nan Heng. He turned to look coldly at Officer Entz, who was still hesitating on whether to approach. By the time Officer Entz reacted and was about to call for help, the people from 11 Base had already rushed over. Jinwan stood outside the crowd. Her hand was held tightly by Feng Ling. She looked at the man whose back was already soaked in blood. Her heart was filled with an indescribable feeling. She only felt that her eyes were instantly wet. Only she knew why Mo Jingshan insisted on killing Dolly with his own hands. Because when she was trapped in the camp for days, it was Dolly who kept beating her, kicking her, and threatening her. It was also Dolly who forced her to kneel down in front of Mo Jingshan to save her life. It was also Dolly who said he was going to use Jinwan as an appetizer. This man had become a nightmare that Jinwan couldn't get rid of in the short term. This spear shot at the brink of death was worth it. That plain white t-shirt was now stained with blood, and it was impossible to tell whose blood it was. Finally, the police rushed over and took away the children who needed to be taken away. Those who needed to be defused did so, and those who needed to check the bodies of Akib and his accomplices went to check the bodies. Jinwan took the opportunity when Feng Ling's hand finally loosened a little to abruptly pull her hand out and rush toward him. There were policemen all around and they all recognized her. No one intended to stop her. "Mr. Mo, your injury is now." The people at the base were about to ask him to hurry back and bandage his wound. "It's fine. Take these children away first." Mo Jingshan was covered in blood, and his eyes were cold. He just stood there but no one dared to approach him. Jinwan ran to his side, supported him and asked anxiously, "How are you?" He seemed to realize that it was really Jinwan who broke the deadlock and suddenly shot Akib in the back. Jinwan pressed her hand against his arm and was about to continue speaking when she suddenly felt a pain in her hand. The man abruptly pulled her away and held her hand tightly in his palm. The pain made her face pale and she looked at him in surprise. "What did I tell you before I left? Didn't I tell you to wait where you are?" The man's eyes were cold and sharp. When he looked at her, there was not the slightest warmth in his eyes. The coldness in his eyes made Jinwan freeze on the spot. Her mouth moved but for a moment she couldn't speak. She couldn't explain a word. Should she say that she was worried about him? Or should she say something to coax him not to be angry? No matter what she said, she couldn't stop the blood from flowing out of his back. Jinwan abruptly held his arm with force, holding on with all her might to prevent him from pushing her away. She said calmly, "The injury on your back can't be ignored anymore. Let's go back and find a doctor. His injury should be very serious." Earlier, not only did his wound tear, but he had also been attacked several times in the same spot. The injury that had already penetrated deep into his flesh was most likely even more serious now. Mo Jingshan did not move much before Jinwan forcefully pulled him away. Jinwan held him, passing by the terrible blood and mess on the ground. She did not even glance at it. She only wanted to take Mo Jingshan away from this place. The police and the people at the base were all busy. The gloomy weather that had been gloomy all morning suddenly became gloomy, until it began to rain. Jinwan raised her head to look up. As she supported Mo Jingshan toward the direction of the helicopter, she asked, "It's raining. Will there still be any danger of explosions here?" "Yes, most of the landmines here were buried during the war decades ago. The dense forest is thick with branches and leaves. The rain is not heavy so it won't penetrate through. The ground is still dry. If the rain gets heavier, the areas that need to be exploded will still explode, but they won't be connected together. The area of explosion will shrink, and the forest won't be on fire." After speaking, Mo Jingshan suddenly coughed. Jinwan rushed to support him. "Those children have been rescued. Leave the rest to the police. Let's go find a doctor first." Before she finished, all of a sudden, there was a ping sound from behind them. A gunshot. Very close. Jinwan's entire body trembled. Before she could react, she was abruptly pressed into Mo Jingshan's arms. In the next moment, the bullet almost brushed past their shoulders and landed heavily on the helicopter, leaving a deep dent in the hard steel body. Jinwan raised her head from Mo Jingshan's arms to see that Akib, who had been pretending to be dead for a long time, was lying on the ground covered in blood. With only one breath left, he actually took the opportunity when the police were dealing with the bomb on Dolly's body to shoot them. Thankfully, Feng Ling was close. She reacted quickly and fired at the same time, hitting Akib's wrist. This shot that was originally aimed at killing them was directly deflected. Following that, Feng Ling expressionlessly walked toward Akib step by step. She shot at various parts of his body. Akib's entire body twitched as the bullets continuously pierced through him. Finally, he breathed his last breath. Jinwan looked at Akib, who was covered in bloody holes and was completely stunned. It was not until the man who had been protecting her in his arms suddenly went limp and knelt on the ground that Jinwan subconsciously raised her hand to hold him. Due to the difference in height and weight, she almost lost her balance and fell backward. She hurriedly tried to stand up. "Jingshan." Jinwan hugged Mo Jingshan tightly as he suddenly fell on her. She felt the blood flowing down his back. Earlier, when he suddenly turned around to avoid the bullet, his wound had been aggravated by this movement. Chapter 311. Mr. Mo will take you back right away. The doctor is already waiting. Feng Ling came quickly and was about to help Jinwan hold him. But Jinwan had already stood firmly. She looked down at him and said clearly, Mo Jingshan, if anything happens to you, I'll remarry with the child in my belly and let your child call someone else dad. Feng Ling. She suddenly felt it was not appropriate to reach out to help him. The man who fell on Jinwan suddenly chuckled. He leaned against her shoulder and chuckled hoarsely. His voice was so hoarse and weak that it was almost breathless, but it was still full of threat. How dare you? If anything happens to you, I'll dare to remarry. If you don't believe me, try it. Jinwan resisted the sourness in her nose, hugged him tightly, gave Feng Ling a look, and helped Mo Jingshan into the helicopter with Feng Ling. I'll call someone to send you back right away. We'll deal with the aftermath. Feng Ling helped Mo Jingshan sit in the helicopter with Jinwan and then quickly walked out. Seeing the blood on Mo Jingshan's body, Jinwan was about to lift his clothes to have a look, but her hand was held by the man and pulled down. Mo Jingshan sat on the soft chair in the airport, panted, and said without looking back, narrowed his eyes. What did you say just now? I'm not dead yet and you're thinking of remarrying? It was the first time she had seen Mo Jingshan injured like this. In the past, he had never even had a headache or fever in front of her. Suddenly, he was so weak that she was really afraid that something would happen to him. She was so anxious that she tried to threaten him to hold on. The man suddenly looked at her murderously. Who do you dare to marry? Jinwan pursed her lips. The premise is that you don't die. You have to live well and keep an eye on me every day. Then I can't run away. She couldn't speak out her emotions. Seeing him injured like this, she couldn't get emotional at all, but she didn't want him to worry too much, so she could only try to calm down. Mo Jingshan looked at her sideways and saw the emotions she had been hiding. I won't die. He raised his hand with some difficulty and stroked her soft hair as usual. I am yours and my life is also yours. I won't let go easily. Don't think too much. Tell Feng Ling that there's no rush to send us back. Defuse the bombs first. Earlier, the landmines around us didn't explode. The people from the base must have found the fuse and cut it off first. Now the danger is mostly gone. Remember to negotiate with the Cambodian local police. There are still many landmines around. Tell them to be careful and not to get too close. Jinwan listened attentively, nodding as she listened. She would convey the message to Feng Ling later. But his voice was getting softer and softer. In the end, there was only silence. She glanced sideways and saw that Mo Jingshan's eyes were closed. His face was pale and his body was covered in blood. However, even though he had fainted, his hand still held hers without letting go. The danger in the jungle was finally over. When the helicopter took off, Mo Jingshan had already woken up. It was raining outside the cabin. Although the rain wasn't heavy, it did have a small effect. It delayed the detonation of the newly buried landmines underground, giving them more time to search and clear the mines. Akib and his men were all captured, dead or injured. Have the children been sent back? Jinwan asked. Regardless of whether it was Akib's death or Dali's death, this group of evil people could not be treated as humans. Thus, even though she saw this bloody scene, she didn't feel much pity. She only sighed a little. However, the thing that weighed heavily on her heart was the innocent child who had died. Not yet. The base doctor will first treat the children's injuries before sending them back. We don't want to scare their parents, Feng Ling replied. 6 of the children have minor abrasions. One of them was shot in both legs. The bullet pierced through his leg bones. He's destined to be crippled for life. As for the one who was blown up, Feng Ling paused. Every time she was sent out on a dangerous mission, she was used to seeing life and death. However, she still couldn't bear to see innocent children get hurt, especially since the average age of these children was less than 6 years old. The dead can't be brought back to life. We'll think of a way to comfort their parents. We can give them some money or other ways to comfort them. Then leave more money. If the base doesn't have enough money, I can also provide some. I can still afford to help these children grow up, Jinwan said. Feng Ling glanced at her but didn't speak. All of a sudden, Jinwan heard the man who had been resting by her side let out a low chuckle. It was very mild. She turned to look at Mo Jingshan. Why aren't you closing your eyes to rest? What are you laughing about? 11 base is Nan Heng's territory. He's a famous arms dealer in both the black and white worlds. His money is beyond your imagination. There's no need for you to do anything. Mo Jingshan's lips were slightly pale and his voice was low. Nan Heng was not on the plane right now. Jin Wan had no choice but to find something to distract herself. Otherwise, if she kept looking at the wound on Mo Jingshan's back, her heart would be in pain. Since he's so powerful, why does it seem like he's under your control? It seems like he doesn't dare to offend you at all. Jin Wan moved closer to Mo Jingshan's ear and whispered. She didn't want Feng Ling to hear these words, but Feng Ling's hearing was extremely good. Mo Jingshan's pale, handsome brows only moved slightly. He smiled lightly and didn't say anything. However, Feng Ling directly said, because Nan Heng first mingled in the underworld in America. Now that he's able to traverse both the black and white worlds, it's all because of Mr. Mo. Without Mr. Mo's help, it wouldn't be so easy for him to clear his name. You mean that on the path of the underworld no one can control Nan Heng, but on the path of clearing his name, Mo Jingshan is the boss above him? Feng Ling pursed her lips. And that's roughly what I mean. In other words, Nan Heng is 11 Base's boss, and Mo Jingshan is Nan Heng's boss. So, 11 Base also belongs to Mo Jingshan? You can say that. Jin Wan's expression suddenly changed. No wonder that day when I washed the socks the group of people in your base had such expressions. Everyone knew that she was Mrs. Mo. She suddenly understood their feelings very well. What socks? Mo Jingshan's voice suddenly interrupted Jin Wan and Feng Ling's conversation. This was not the first time he heard these words. Mo Jingshan's gaze directly landed on Jin Wan's face. Feng Ling. She suddenly didn't dare to speak anymore. She only used her gaze to look at Jin Wan. Jin Wan wanted to use this matter to make a joke to ease her feelings, but she turned to look at the blood on the man's body. The scene of blood splattering everywhere from the gunshot earlier was still vivid in her mind. Chapter 312. The people of 11 Base were responsible for sending the children back to the farm. Everyone packed up and prepared to leave Tunnel Sap Lake before dark. Because of Mo Jingshan's injuries and the other injured people's conditions, they had to go to the hospital in the Cambodian capital first and then return to America the next morning. Jin Wan asked if she was going back to America with them. Nan Heng only replied that Mo Jingshan was going to America. Shouldn't she go? The answer was, of course, to go. At this moment, Mo Jingshan sat on a chair in the Cambodian treatment room. The doctors and nurses kept making a fuss. Occasionally they couldn't help but say a lot because of the severity of the injury on Mo Jingshan's back. As they tended to his wounds, they stared at his incomparably handsome face and kept looking for opportunities to say more. Jin Wan couldn't understand what they were talking about. When she saw the female doctor and nurse staring at Mo Jingshan's face and back, her heart instantly felt as though a bottle of vinegar had been poured onto a flame. It was hot and sour. However, she couldn't act up at this moment. Mo Jingshan's injuries were too serious. The doctors were tending to his wounds. She couldn't possibly run over to help him put on a shirt and then take him away from the hospital. However, no matter what the doctors and nurses were saying, and no one knew if Mo Jingshan understood them or not, he just sat there quietly. When Jin Wan suddenly got up to go out to take a breath, he stopped her. "Where are you going?" She looked at him. Although the man did not even frown when he was enduring the pain, his forehead was still slightly sweaty. He allowed the nurses to stitch up his wounds with tweezers and needle. Although the veins on the back of his hands were clearly visible, he did not make a sound. He only opened his eyes to look at her. "I'll go get a glass of water," Jin Wan said and went out to find a water dispenser. She would never say that it was because the nurses had been staring at his face and saying a lot of things. They helped him disinfect and leaned down to his shoulder to whisper softly into his ear. This scene almost knocked over her bottle of vinegar. It's not the right time to be jealous, but she doesn't understand their Cambodian language, which makes her even more nervous. She doesn't want them to be careless when treating the wound, so she just goes out for a walk. But Jin Wan couldn't go out for too long. Feng Ling was outside. After chatting with Feng Ling for a while, she poured a glass of water and went back. Then he held the cup of water and watched the scene inside. Mo Jingshan's blood-stained shirt was tossed on the ground. His entire body was covered in dust, and there was an indistinct bruise on his brow bone. Because she was finally back. The man raised his eyebrows slightly and looked at her from the corner of his eye. He smiled faintly as if he had already seen the jealousy in her eyes. He just sat there dirty and disheveled but damn handsome. This was the first time Jin Wan realized that a person's good looks did not only come from their clean and presentable appearance. Although Mo Jingshan's appearance was indeed God's most outstanding creation, at this moment, this man's handsomeness was not the faint and noble appearance she was familiar with. Instead, it was the masculinity that flowed from his bones. He did not wear the expensive suit he usually wore, nor did he tidy up his incomparably handsome appearance. But right now his attractiveness was fatal. Thus, it was understandable that these female doctors and nurses would be infatuated with him under the pretense of treating his wound. The stitching of his wound continued until 9:30 p.m. Mo Jingshan finally put on his clothes. Before taking the plane back to America, everyone took the opportunity to relax and found a decent noodle shop near the hospital. They ordered several bowls of beef noodles to be delivered to the hospital. Because Mo Jingshan's wound had been stitched up, he could not move for the time being. Thus, the task of feeding Boss Missouri food naturally fell onto Jinwan. Jinwan stood before Mo Jingshan. As she stirred the noodles in the bowl, she said, "A few days ago when I fed you food for the first time, you spilled the soup in the bowl." Mo Jingshan faltered. He could clearly sense that she wanted to settle the score with him later. Under those circumstances, it would only be a problem if I ate it. Although the two of them were well aware of this, he still explained. Jinwan immediately rolled her eyes at him. "Then when I fed you water, you should have continued to treat me coldly. Why did you suddenly tease me?" Mo Jingshan. Although she said that, Jinwan could not bear to let him starve right now. Right now he was a heavily injured patient and needed to be taken care of. Mo Jingshan watched as the little woman carefully blew on the slightly hot noodles and then fed it to his mouth. He looked at her and chuckled lightly. "You didn't manage to feed me once or twice, so you have to find an opportunity to feed me again, right? Don't tell me you can't even lift your arms and shoulders right now." Jinwan directly pressed the noodles to his lips. "The doctor said that before the wound heals, you can't move your shoulders or back. Otherwise it'll easily tear again. When that happens it'll be difficult." The man looked at her serious expression and curved his lips. He gave her face and ate the noodles she fed him. Earlier, Jinwan had taken a few bites from the other bowl. The Cambodian people's taste was different from that in China. Although this noodle soup was made by a very good noodle restaurant near the hospital, she didn't like the taste in the noodle soup. It was sour but not sweet, and it was salty. In short, she just couldn't get used to it. Thankfully, the broth was clean, and the noodles were relatively soft. Noodles nourished the stomach and were easy to digest. It was suitable for people who were temporarily injured and could not move around much. Thus, she had to think of a way to let him eat more. After the meal, the people from the base were already preparing to board the plane. Jinwan went to help with the luggage. Mo Jingshan did not stay idle either. He chatted with Nan Heng and Officer Entz for a long time. When Jinwan went to look for him again, she happened to see an extremely bright light outside the helicopter casting a dazzling glow on his body. His expression was serene, as though nothing he had experienced in the past few days could disturb his calm and steady footsteps. She didn't know what Officer Entz had said to him, but he did not say a word. Only a hint of coldness appeared in his brows. Seeing that Jinwan had come over, Mo Jingshan listened to the doctor's advice and did not move. He only used his eyes to indicate for her to come over. Jinwan quickly approached him and stood in front of him. The lights fell on their bodies and their shadows intertwined. Cambodia's winter was stifling and hot for many days. Tonight it finally felt cooler. Jinwan faced the direction of Tunnel Sap Lake. Cambodia's night sky was silent. Only the bright stars twinkled. This country was very beautiful. Chapter 313. They finally set off for America. There were only 4 people on this plane: Jinwan, Feng Ling, Nan Heng and Mo Jingshan. Nan Heng was covered in the smell of cigarettes. He had just extinguished a cigarette before boarding the plane. Recently he had smoked more than usual. Feng Ling sat slightly further away from them. She sat in the seat in front, separated from the driver's seat, and chatted with Jinwan occasionally. Compared to the 2 women's voices, the 2 men in the cabin were much quieter. Nan Heng calmly leaned against the seat, folding his arms like a master. He closed his eyes and prepared to sleep. Mo Jingshan turned his body. He could not move around frequently for the time being, so he lazily leaned against the window of the cabin and looked outside. The man's eyelashes cast a gentle shadow on his face. Jinwan almost forgot the thrill she had just experienced. She almost thought that she had just returned from a tropical country with Great Boss Missouri on a vacation and was on the return flight. This man always made people feel at ease. A sense of security, belonging, and stability. Everything came from him. Jinwan did not know when she had fallen asleep. When she woke up, her head was heavy. She could still hear the sound of the propeller by her ears. She was still on the plane, so she must not have slept for long. However, the dazzling light from the window indicated that they had already flown across half the world. In just a few hours of flight they had passed through day and night. Originally, she had been feeling uncomfortable because of her morning sickness and other pregnancy symptoms, especially after flying for such a long time. However, right now she felt especially comfortable lying down. She came to her senses under the glaring light and came to her senses. She was lying on Mo Jingshan's lap. He was still injured. Jinwan rushed to climb up and turned to see the man's gaze landing on her face. Mo Jingshan pushed her slightly messy hair behind her ear, gently asking, "Why didn't you sleep a little longer? You're injured, yet you're letting me lean on you. Your body is already stiff and uncomfortable when you can't move. Now that you're carrying my weight, you should have woken me up," Jinwan said as she rushed to check the wound on his back. However, there was no more blood seeping out of his clothes. She sighed in relief. "I only suffered some superficial wounds on my back. It's not like I can't touch my whole body." Mo Jingshan was about to reach out to pick up the blanket that had fallen off her body. She was afraid that he would pull his mouth, so she pressed his hand down and turned to pick up the blanket herself. At this moment the cabin was a little quiet. They didn't know if Nan Hung was really asleep or just taking a nap. Even if he heard the sound, he probably couldn't be bothered to care. Feng Ling hadn't slept, but she didn't speak either. She leaned against the wall of the cabin and didn't speak. No one knew what she was thinking. Jinwan lowered her voice. "Feng Ling, aren't you going to sleep? We're almost there. Mrs. Mo, you haven't had much rest these days. Pregnant people like to sleep and get tired easily. It's not good for you to stay with us like this. After we arrive in America, go to the hospital to have a good checkup." Previously, when they were in the Cambodian hospital, there were many injured people who needed urgent treatment. However, they didn't trust the hospital there, so they didn't let Jinwan go for a checkup. Now that they were about to land in America, it was better for her to go for a checkup. "I understand. I'll find some time to go take a look." Jinwan didn't want to cause trouble for them, nor did she want them to worry, so she directly agreed. However, when she heard that they were about to arrive, she subconsciously glanced outside. She could only see the American sky and the warm and dazzling setting sun, shining brightly. It had been many years since she came to America. Her expression was dazed for a moment before she suddenly asked, "Are we going to 11 base? Or are we going to Officer Ensa's place?" "We'll stop at the temporary airport in Los Angeles first. Our people will negotiate with Officer Ensa's men. You and Mr. Mo must be sent to the hospital immediately. His wound is deep and the wound on his head isn't light either. He still needs a series of examinations and follow-up treatment. Your body also needs a further examination. You don't have to worry about anything else. Rest in the hospital. This is no longer Cambodia. There won't be so many scary things nearby. Just relax." As Feng Ling spoke, she glanced at the time again. "We'll probably land in half an hour. Mrs. Mo, if you feel any discomfort, let me know. I'll have them land as slowly as possible." "I'm fine. I can land normally." But Los Angeles, it was actually Los Angeles. That was right. If not Los Angeles, where else could she go? The Mo family's company, Shine Group, was here. 11 Base was also in the suburbs of Los Angeles. She had also studied abroad in Los Angeles. To Jinwan, this place could be considered familiar. However, many years had truly passed. Including the 10 years in her previous life, she had crossed over even more years. There were many things that she could not remember clearly when she was young and ignorant. She suddenly felt a warmth in her hand. She turned to see Mo Jingshan's hand holding her, imprisoning her in his palm. As the plane was about to land, it slowly descended and passed by the Los Angeles River. The ancient bridge on First Street above the river was an important hub for entering and exiting Los Angeles. Jinwan looked down at the Los Angeles River. She suddenly heard Mo Jingshan's voice by her ear. "When you were studying in America, did you often come to the Los Angeles River?" She did not understand why he would suddenly ask this question. After thinking for a long time, she finally said, "My school was very far from here, so I rarely came to Los Angeles. However, there were a few times when I went out for gatherings with friends and classmates. At night, when I was bored, I would take a walk by the river. I did come here. At that time, I seemed to have gotten separated from them. In the middle of the night, the streetlights by the river were broken. That night was especially dark." Speaking up to hear, Jinwan's eyes brightened. She seemed to have recalled something. "That's right, at that time I also saved someone from the river. That person was covered in blood. I don't know how he was injured. If I hadn't been quick enough to catch him, he would have been washed downstream. Downstream is a waterfall. It's quite dangerous. Her voice had yet to land when she suddenly felt the man's gaze fixed on her. Jinwan choked. Her eyes met his, and a memory that she had hidden for a long time and did not place in her heart suddenly leaped up. The difference between mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and a first kiss. She was stunned for a while before she raised her head abruptly and met the man's smiling eyes in disbelief. Chapter 3:14. Before she could ask more questions, the plane had already landed. The cabin door was quickly opened. Feng Ling picked up her cell phone and called someone, but in an instant, many people had gathered outside the plane. Even after getting off the plane, Mo Jingshan did not let go of Jinwan's hand. Jinwan did not have a chance to ask him again, and the two of them were pushed by a group of people to the hospital. The wound on Mo Jingshan's back was not well treated in the Cambodian hospital. The doctor arranged a special passage for him, and he went for surgery as soon as he arrived. The surgery lasted from 6:30 p.m. to 10 p.m. American time. Because of the general anesthesia, Mo Jingshan did not wake up for the whole night. The police and the people from the base left after the surgery. After making sure that Mo Jingshan's wound was completely fine, Nan Hung was persuaded by Jinwan to return to the base. Jinwan was supposed to stay in the ward to take care of him, but because he had just had an operation, Mo Jingshan needed to rest in the sterile ward tonight and would not be allowed in until tomorrow morning. She couldn't go in now, so she stood outside the ward and looked at the man's pale but still handsome face through the huge glass window. Her mind kept replaying the scene of Mo Jingshan looking at her before the plane landed. Was it him? The man covered in blood, the man she accidentally saved by the Los Angeles River, was it Mo Jingshan? Feng Ling went out to buy some daily necessities Jinwan needed. When she came back, she saw Jinwan leaning against the glass window and went up to persuade her. She said that Mr. Mo had recovered a lot and needed to sleep for a day because of the anesthesia. He would be fine when he woke up tomorrow. She then took her to the OB/GYN department for a checkup. After the checkup, Jinwan's physical condition was good. There was no problem, but she had been emotionally unstable these days. In China's words, the fetus had been affected and was not very stable. She needed to rest in bed for a few days. The burns on her hands also needed to be properly treated, so she arranged a comfortable ward on another floor for Jinwan so that she could rest and accompany Mo Jingshan here. It wasn't easy for him to be able to lie down on a bed with peace of mind. There were no longer gunshots or explosions ringing in his ears, and there was no longer any threat to his life. However, Jinwan suddenly could not sleep. After tossing and turning for a long time, she picked up her phone and saw that Xia Tian had called her a day ago, as well as a few text messages. Where is he? Why aren't you picking up the phone? I'm not planning to come back yet. Cambodia doesn't even have any local specialties. How could it be worth your time? Come back quickly, there are hundreds of millions of orders waiting for you, Bossji. As soon as Jinwan returned to High City, she went to Cambodia. She only took the time to call Xia Tian and said that she was going to Cambodia for a vacation. Xia Tian thought that she was under too much pressure from studying in T-City and allowed her to come out and play happily. This so-called vacation was really an unforgettable experience. Jinwan smiled and called Xia Tian back. It was night in Los Angeles, but it was already morning in China. Xia Tian was in a meeting in the studio. After Jinwan briefly told her about her schedule, Xia Tian hurriedly said that she was in a meeting and directly hung up. She put down her phone and lay back on the bed. She picked up the ultrasound test report by the bedside and looked at the small blurry image on it. Earlier, when she went for a checkup, the doctor said that the cute oval dot in the middle was what the baby looked like when it was still an embryo. After staring at it for a long time, Jinwan's gradually settled heart gradually calmed down, and she finally felt a little sleepy. However, she did not sleep for long. After sleeping for only a few hours, she suddenly woke up with a start. In the dream, Mo Jingshan was covered in blood. In that small wooden house, Dolly had a gun pointed at his forehead. Jinwan rushed in as though she had gone mad. The moment the gunshot rang out, she screamed hoarsely, but she could not make a single sound. She could only watch as blood splattered everywhere. She did not even see how Mo Jingshan had fallen after being shot. She only saw the ground covered in fresh blood. The warm blood seemed to have flowed to her feet. She was shocked to the point of breaking out in a cold sweat. She abruptly opened her eyes and sat up. Her nose was filled with the smell of disinfectant. This was a ward in a hospital in Los Angeles. It was white and quiet. There was no dolly, no gun, and no blood, Jinwan closed her eyes, raised her hand to rub her sweaty temples, and let out a long sigh of relief. Fortunately, it was just a dream. Jinwan lifted the quilt and got out of bed. She was wearing a brand new light blue hospital gown, which was very soft and comfortable. There were 2 delicate bags on the sofa in the ward, which were the clothes Feng Ling had bought for her before she left. As for the clothes she wore in Cambodia, of course they were all thrown away, leaving no trace. Her dream was full of scenes of Mo Jingshan being injured. Jinwan really could not sleep. Although she had taken a shower before going to bed, she still habitually took a shower to relieve her stress. She went directly into the small bathroom in this luxurious single ward. When she came out of the bathroom, the sky outside the window was already white, and it was already 6 o'clock in the morning. Last night, the doctor said that she could only enter Mo Jingshan's ward after 6 o'clock. She took a look at the time, quickly dried her hair, combed it back with her fingers and walked out. Chapter 315. Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan. Muttering his name in her heart, Jinwan leaned down. Her soft lips kissed the bruise on his brows, his eyes, his high nose, and finally the man's light lips. However, she did not dare to kiss too hard. She only touched his lips and was about to get up. However, just as she was about to move away, the man's eyes, which had been quietly closed, slowly opened at this moment. When her lips were a few inches away from his light-colored thin lips moved slightly. "Being kissed awake by you early in the morning, is this my reward for returning safely with all 4 limbs intact?" The man's voice was low and hoarse, but each word struck her heart. Jinwan's expression turned awkward, but she did not move away. She looked at the man's face so close to her and stared at his slightly drowsy eyes that were as dark as the deep sea. "When did you wake up?" Mo Jingshan looked at her and chuckled softly. "I just woke up. It's only 6 o'clock now. The doctor said that the effects of the anesthesia would only subside after more than 10 hours. Why are you awake now?" The little woman leaning against the side of the ward was much thinner than when she was in T-City. Her chin was much sharper and there were obvious dark circles around her eyes, a sign that she did not sleep well. Even though the lights were not too bright, her expression could not be hidden. He raised his brows slightly, speaking hoarsely. "Not to mention that it's already been 10 hours, even if I had just been injected with anesthesia, I would still wake up if you kissed me like this." Jinwan smiled and was about to bring a chair over to sit by the bed to accompany him and take care of him. However, just as she was about to take the chair, she suddenly heard Mo Jingshan say, "Don't sit. Come over, lie down." Jinwan heard him move slightly, as though he was about to give up half of the bed to her. She rushed to turn her head. "Don't move. Your wound has already been repeatedly injured several times. Now that the surgery is finally over, you have to rest quietly. You can't move for the next few days. The dark circles under your eyes are so big that you can't hide them. You came here at 6 o'clock. Do you think you're an immortal who doesn't need to sleep and rest?" The man's tone was tainted with some of his usual instigation, and his eyes signaled her to come over. Jinwan could only walk back to the bed and sit down. "I've slept. It's just that what I've seen and heard these past few days was too intense. I have nightmares and I might need some time to recover." "Are you still talking about me? You didn't eat or drink for a few days, didn't you?" "I just slept a little less. Oh my God." Mo Jingshan ignored her sophistry. He clearly understood the changes in Jinwan's heart. She needed time to recover from the shock, and he couldn't just stand there and watch her be scared. "It's still early. You need to rest too. You'll have nightmares if you sleep alone. Just sleep here, okay?" He laid flat and didn't move as she said. His voice was patient and gentle as he coaxed her to lie down with him. Although this was a single bed, it was slightly larger than the beds in ordinary hospitals. If Jinwan really lay down, there would be more than enough space. There was only him under the blanket. She sat on the edge of the bed, looked at the sky outside the window, and then glanced at Mo Jingshan. "Then promise you won't move. If something happens to your stitched back because of me, I'll never come to your ward to accompany you again." The man seemed to chuckle. It was a light chuckle that came from his chest. He didn't expose her thoughts of wanting to lie down but was too embarrassed to do so. He only answered, "N." Jinwan took a corner of the blanket, lifted it, and lay down on her side. Mo Jingshan's hand held hers, but Jinwan carefully slapped his hand away. "You said you won't move. Not even your hand?" Mo Jingshan's voice was by her ears. "No, if your fingers move, your finger bones will move. If your finger bones move, your arm will move, then your shoulder and then your back, head and neck. You can't move at all. Jean Wan said as she carefully lay down as if facing a formidable enemy. She didn't dare to touch him. She didn't expect that one day when she slept by Mo Jingshan's side, she didn't even dare to touch him. How weak do you think I am? How can my back be injured when I hold your hand? When he said this, it was clearly a calm statement, but it sounded like a tease. It even seemed to contain the grievance of wanting to hold his wife but not being able to. Jean Wan lay flat and looked at the incandescent crystal lights on the ceiling. She sighed that not only was this hospital's medical standards excellent, but even this special ward was luxuriously decorated. If it weren't for the fact that the color was close to white, if it weren't for this white bed, it would be comparable to a 5-star hotel. In order not to let his wound be affected again, she simply turned over on the bed and faced him. I'll watch you sleep like this, okay? If you watch me like this, how can I sleep? The man said with a faint smile. Jean Wan, do I affect you like this? Then I'll go back to my own ward? He paused, slowly withdrew his hand that was about to hold her hand, and said meticulously, You'd better lie here. His next words, You're easily frightened when you have nightmares. I can comfort you whenever I'm here. Jean Wan was silent for 2 seconds. Did I often have nightmares before? Mo Jingshan suddenly glanced at her. Can your memory be any worse? A few months ago, you had a fever and begged me not to leave. You trembled all over and couldn't wake up from the nightmare. Don't you remember? It seemed that there was such a thing. It seems that I haven't had those nightmares for a long time. She leaned against his side, carefully pressed her face against his uninjured shoulder, and spoke in a low voice. Mo Jingshan gazed at her for 2 seconds. Sleep. I'm here. Okay. Even though he couldn't move, he still slowly put his hand on hers under the quilt. There are not only peaceful countries in this world. As long as you want to experience it, you can find a country more chaotic than Cambodia at any time. What you see and hear in a war-torn country will only be more tragic than those. Take some time to watch more news about the war, and you won't have nightmares about the death of these fugitives. That blood is what they deserve, and they lost their lives. Human life is indeed very fragile. Living in a peaceful world, you should cherish this peace. Okay. Jean Wan knew that he was counseling her. She had heard that many people who left war-torn countries or some special disaster sites would go to a psychologist for counseling, so some people could never walk out of the bloody shadow of death. Her heart was not so fragile. Chapter 316. On the same bed, she turned her body slightly, but she was afraid that her movements would affect his wound, so even if she moved a little, she was very careful. It felt like the two of them had become one. His pain was her pain and his wound was her wound. Just now the hospital corridor was a little cold, but the ward was very warm. Jean Wan was covered with the quilt. Her hair, which had just been showered, was still wet and pressed against her head. She pulled the quilt slightly, stretched out her arms and carefully spread her hair out, no longer using it as a pillow. Through the dim light in the ward, Mo Jingshan saw the burns on the backs of her hands. The light blue hospital gown covered the wounds near her wrists, and the white gauze wrapped around the backs of her hands again and again. Nan Heng knows a lot of friends and doctors who often go through fire and water. I asked him to get some medicine that can remove burn scars. You can apply it every day, he said in a low voice. He sounded calm, but there was a hint of heartache in his tone. Jean Wan glanced at her hand and smiled. I'm fine. It's just that the top layer of skin was scalded and had a lot of blisters. Then I added some herbal ash to it so it looks very serious. Yesterday, when the doctor here applied medicine on my wound, a layer of scalded skin had fallen off. The skin and flesh inside are not seriously scalded, but it may turn red for a while. I'll be fine after resting for a while. It was good enough that she could leave that place alive. If she didn't even have a scar, then what she had experienced might just be a fairy tale. Anyway, it was just a layer of skin that was scalded, and it would heal after a long time. It was not a deep scar. Mo Jingshan withdrew his gaze and held her hand under the quilt. Jean Wan reminded him, just hold it gently. Don't use too much force. You'll hurt your arm and shoulder blades. I know, he said flatly. Obviously, he was a little upset that she had scalded herself. But it was true that he was not a delicate man and she was not a delicate woman. Some traces left behind proved that they had indeed gone through fire and water together. Such traces were more meaningful than any wedding ring, gift, or souvenir. Mo Jingshan was obviously still under the effect of the anesthetic. He closed his eyes tiredly. Jean Wan lay beside him and changed the topic, wanting him to rest peacefully. Why did you ask me if I often went to the Los Angeles River? Did I ask? You clearly asked me when the plane landed yesterday. That should be it. He even anesthetized his head during a surgery? You even forgot what you asked me yesterday. Did you forget a lot of things when you didn't have surgery? Jinwan was exasperated. So when I was 16, the night I was separated from my friend because the streetlights around us were broken, the person I fished up from the Los Angeles River was you? Mo Jingshan smiled. It seemed like she didn't lose her memory. She just didn't realize that she had unintentionally done a good deed and saved his life, so she didn't take it to heart. He closed his eyes and tightened his grip on her fingertips. I was more seriously injured than I am now. 11 Base's helicopter exploded a kilometer above the Los Angeles River, and I fell into the river. If it weren't for you, I would have been swept into the waterfall downstream, and there would be no Mo Jingshan in this world. It was, really, she had just experienced all this in Cambodia, so she was not too surprised by what he said. She was just curious. She suddenly turned her head to look at the man's face so close to her. At that time, the street lights were broken and it was dark around the river. She only noticed that there seemed to be a lot of blood on his body. Perhaps because she had watched too many American sci-fi war movies, she was still young and had a little heroic feeling, so she wanted to save him. At that time, because she was young and bold, she didn't feel scared when she saw so much blood on his body, but she didn't see his face clearly. Later, when her separated friend called to urge her to go to the bridge to go back to school with him, she carefully helped him to a safe place on the shore, and before he woke up, she ran away in a hurry, but she didn't expect that person to be Mo Jingshan. For Jinwan, those memories were 10 years away, so it was really a long time ago to think about it. So, it was you who arranged the marriage between the Mo family and the Ji family? You didn't do it to repay me, did you? Jinwan's voice suddenly became bitter. Tut, please don't do it to repay me. She didn't like it. Mo Jingshan smiled. No, there are many ways to repay me. I don't have to sell myself. Jinwan? Sell herself? Wasn't this equivalent to being openly despised by Mo Jingshan? The marriage was indeed grandfather's proposal, but the choice was mine. At first, because I knew it was you, I just paid more attention to you, but the real reason for the marriage had nothing to do with repayment. Then what's the reason? The man glanced at her. Are you sure you want me, a patient, to lie here and tell you so much? Just this one? I suddenly feel very sleepy. Can I just say this one? I can't fall asleep if you keep doing this. I'm really sleepy. In the past, it was fine if she didn't know about it, but now that she suddenly had so many connections, Jinwan's curiosity was piqued. However, he held back and didn't continue. Can't you make it short? The man didn't speak anymore, just gently held her fingers with his palm, stroked the gauze wrapped around the back of her hand, and closed his eyes as if he was really falling asleep. Jinwan wanted to ask more, but he had just had an operation last night and was woken up early in the morning by her. Her lips moved. Although she was unwilling, she closed her mouth and didn't disturb him anymore. She lay beside him and looked at the man. Finally, Mo Jingshan really fell asleep. She could see how much energy he had put into talking with her for so long. But she had to admit that the fear in her heart caused by the encounter a few days ago was really taken away. At this moment, except for the question marks and curiosity in her head, everything else seemed to have been squeezed out, and the feeling of panic was gone. She stared at him for a while before she gradually felt sleepy. She slowly withdrew her hand from his palm and gently placed it on his chest, feeling his steady heartbeat. Beat after beat, it seemed to pass through the gauze in her palm and spread from her hand to her limbs and bones. It warmed her blood and nerves, allowing her to completely find the long-lost sense of security. Chapter 317. Los Angeles Hospital. At 8 o'clock in the morning, Nan Heng and Fong Ling got out of the black SUV. Fong Ling went straight to Jinwan's ward without saying a word. Nan Heng stood there, glanced at her back, raised his eyebrows, and smoked a cigarette at the door of the hospital before going in. However, when he was about to go to Mo Jingshan's ward, Fong Ling suddenly came over with a dark face. Nan Heng glanced at her and heard the short-haired woman say, "Mrs. Mo is missing." Missing? Our men are guarding outside the hospital. How could she go out without a sound? I'll go look for her. Wait, don't rush, Nan Heng said and pushed the door open to enter Mo Jingshan's ward. However, as soon as he stepped in, he suddenly paused and took a step back. He half closed the door of the ward and turned to look at Fong Ling, who had yet to see clearly and had a strange look on her face. As if to make sure he didn't see wrong, Nan Heng hesitated for 2 seconds before he pushed the door open and glanced at the bed. Sure enough, he saw Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan lying in the same bed. Don't look for her. Nan Heng sneered and signaled Feng Ling to look inside. Feng Ling glanced inside and her expression froze. She saw Jin Wan lying on her side carefully beside Mo Jingshan, her hand pressed against Mo Jingshan's chest through the quilt. Although Mo Jingshan was sleeping on his back, he looked particularly calm and warm. She probably came here as soon as the lockdown was lifted this morning. Nan Heng glanced at the scene inside with a playful expression and was about to close the door and leave so as not to disturb the little couple's sleep. However, at this time, the man sleeping in the bed opened his eyes and glanced at the door. Jin Wan didn't sleep very well. Hearing the conversation outside the door, she woke up and looked at the door almost at the same time as Mo Jingshan. When she met Feng Ling's and Nan Heng's eyes, Jin Wan was still a little sleepy and dazed. After 2 or 3 seconds, she sat up and almost forgot that there was an injured man beside her who couldn't move. The moment her hand pressed against Mo Jingshan's arm, she hurriedly withdrew it, looked at the door, and then at the man who was still very calm when he woke up. On the contrary, it was as if she had been caught red-handed in bed. She could have slept by herself, but she ran to her husband's ward and slept on the same bed as him. It was really awkward. Seeing that they were awake, Nan Heng smiled and pushed the door open. Feng Ling stood outside the door, hesitated, and then turned to walk out with the phone. You came at 6? Nan Heng took a look at Jin Wan. And I didn't sleep well last night and woke up very early, so I came over at 6 o'clock. Jin Wan was about to get off the bed when her hand was held by the man on the bed. Don't mind him. Go to sleep. Mo Jingshan's tone was mild and calm. Jin Wan? Her legs, which were about to get off the bed, immediately shrank back. Mo Jingshan's bed was so warm. Of course she couldn't bear to leave. However, although Nan Heng didn't say much when he approached the bed, the look he gave them clearly indicated that he was complaining about the two of them showing off their affection. Weighing between being shameless and being shameless, Jin Wan finally compromised and sat on his bed, not getting off. Jin Wan tugged the blanket closer to her body and then calmly looked at Nan Heng, who was about to reach for a glass of water with one hand and his phone with the other. His expression was confused and silent, and he was looking at the two of them with great displeasure. At this moment, Jin Wan felt deeply ashamed of herself for showing off their affection, so she snuggled under the quilt again, trying to make Nan Heng focus his attention on Mo Jingshan. I just King came to visit the patient. Nan Heng picked up the glass of water and turned to fill it. After drinking half a glass with an ugly expression, he turned to see that Jin Wan had almost snuggled into Mo Jingshan's arms. Nan Heng, this time it was not Jin Wan who wanted to lie down, but Mo Jingshan saw that 2 buttons of her hospital gown were accidentally undone when she slept, revealing a small part of her collarbone and skin, and signaled her to lie down and cover herself with the quilt with his eyes. When she finally lay down again, Jin Wan turned her face away, trying not to look at Nan Heng's expression, but Mo Jingshan held her hand very firmly and had no intention of letting go. Although their hands were both under the quilt, from the outside of the quilt, they could tell what was going on. Jin Wan raised her head and mouthed to him, "Let go of me first." Mo Jingshan glanced at her cheeks and bright eyes that were a little tight because of embarrassment. His lips curved beautifully and he mouthed to her, "No." Jin Wan. Because he was injured, she didn't dare to push or struggle away from his hand too hard. At this time, Nan Heng glanced out of the door of the ward. Seeing that Feng Ling was nowhere to be seen, his face darkened. Hearing the sound of the cup being slammed down, the two of them paused and looked at Nan Heng at the same time. Nan Heng resisted the urge to smash the cup on Mo Jingshan's face and said coldly, "You two be careful. For the sake of the stability of the baby in her belly, you'd better be a vegetarian in the first 3 months of pregnancy, and try to restrain yourself after 3 months." "I just came to see him and took a nap," Jin Wan explained. "Well, I'll restrain myself," Mo Jingshan answered flatly. "Restrain?" Jin Wan was speechless. "Restrain? Restrain? You just took a nap." Why did it sound like he had done something like that just now? She was still a pregnant woman. 10 minutes later, Feng Ling came in with several breakfasts. "Are you all awake?" The short-haired woman didn't even look at Nan Heng and took the breakfasts in her hand to the bedside. "I think you haven't eaten anything yet. Mrs. Mo is now in the period of morning sickness, so I think the nutritious meals in the hospital are not very good. I went to a nearby Chinese restaurant to buy some Chinese breakfast, porridge and fried dough sticks. Is that okay?" Before Jin Wan and Mo Jingshan spoke, Nan Heng had walked over. "Yes. He had just reached out to take his share when Feng Ling picked it up, opened the plastic lid and put it on the table by the bedside. "Mrs. Mo, you eat first." Nanheng. After the breakfasts were distributed, Feng Ling saw Jin Wan come over in only the hospital gown, so she turned to go out and went back to her ward to fetch a coat for Jin Wan. Chapter 318. Nanheng sat on the sofa not far from the bed, opened the plastic bowl and ate a few mouthfuls of porridge. He did not answer Mo Jingshan's question but thought of the picture of Jin Wan lying next to Mo Jingshan and then the picture of Feng Ling not even bothering to look at him. He felt that this bowl of porridge tasted like dog food in his mouth. In fact, Feng Ling is a very delicate person, but she is too good at hiding her emotions. As Jin Wan fed Mo Jingshan breakfast, she said softly, "I've been in contact with her for so long. Although she's cold and distant most of the time, it's just that the protective layer around her is too thick." As she spoke, she blew gently on the bowl and then fed Mo Jingshan a mouthful of porridge, asking with concern, "Is it still hot?" Seeing Jin Wan carefully fearing that he would be scalded, the smile on Mo Jingshan's lips grew clearer. Just now, the head of the bed had swayed a little, and he was now sitting on his stomach. Compared with Nanheng's cold face, his face was like a spring breeze. Nanheng really felt that he couldn't eat breakfast anymore. "I'm afraid you still don't know how he married you?" Nanheng said with a snort. Jin Wan glanced at him and replied, "Do you mean that I saved him by the Los Angeles River a few years ago or something else?" Nanheng's cold brows moved and he was a little surprised. "You know?" Mo Jingshan said lightly, "There's no need to hide it." Nanheng looked at Jin Wan and smiled. "Aren't you afraid that he married you to repay a debt of gratitude?" Jin Wan. He said no. Mo Jingshan glanced at him coldly. "You can't control your own woman and can't bear to see me live a peaceful life, so you want to take the opportunity to sow discord?" Nanheng sneered, leaned back on the sofa like a master, and casually put his hands on the back of the sofa. Looking at the two people on the sickbed, one feeding and the other eating, he sneered and said, "What do you like about this once arrogant and domineering first miss? What's so cute that you, Xiao Mo, are willing to tie the rest of your life to her?" This was a good question. Jin Wan had wanted to ask that earlier. Mo Jingshan did not even think about it. He gently pressed down the spoon that Jin Wan had just brought to his mouth, chuckling softly. "A 16-year-old girl pouting her lips and blowing air at me without any rhyme or reason." As she blew, she said that this was her first kiss. "Isn't that cute enough? Jin Wan, can you not mention this matter again?" From the perspective of her age, he was clearly AF * King retard. Nanheng rolled his eyes. "Is this F * King cute?" Mo Jingshan's elegant and deep brows rose slightly as he calmly said, "At High City's banquet, the way she hid in a corner to avoid the crowd in order to secretly drink a few glasses of wine was especially cute. When she heard that they were going to get married, she stopped her father's car on the street and argued that she wouldn't marry anyone she didn't love was especially cute. In order to escape from the wedding, she used a pair of scissors to poke 10 to 20 holes in her dress was especially cute. At the wedding, she purposely bent her fingers and declared that her fingers were crippled and couldn't wear the wedding ring was especially cute. After the wedding, she was so angry that she refused to throw the bouquet and hid backstage to vent her anger on the flower petals. Jin Wan? She suddenly wanted to find a hole to hide in. Nanheng expressionlessly said, "I'm just asking casually." Mo Jingshan said seriously, "I can count a few more." Nanheng remained expressionless. "Save it for when your wife is 3 months pregnant. Go back to your bedroom and count them." Mo Jingshan looked at him with pity. "Didn't you want to hear it just now?" Nanheng remained expressionless. "I'm about to throw up from the few mouthfuls of porridge I just ate. Don't talk about it. Thank you." Seeing that this topic had come to an end, Jin Wan tested the temperature of the porridge in the bowl, scooped a spoonful and brought it to Mo Jingshan's mouth. When the man looked at her, she pursed her lips and said with a hot face, "No wonder the Mo family flew a new wedding dress from France right after I destroyed it. So you saw it?" Mo Jingshan immediately smiled. Mo Jingshan chuckled softly. "Are the flower petals delicious?" Jin Wan sighed. She held the bowl in one hand and covered her face with the other, looking as if she couldn't bear the memory of her stupid behavior. After a long time, she put down her hand and tried to feed him the porridge calmly, lest she accidentally spilled it on him. "What else do you want to ask?" Mo Jingshan raised his lips and took a look at Nanheng. At the same time, he slowly raised his hand and pushed a strand of hair from Jin Wan's cheek behind her ear. Jin Wan hurriedly turned her head slightly to avoid his hand. "Don't move your hand." Mo Jingshan smiled and put down his hand. Nanheng waved his hand on the sofa, looking as if his heart had been devastated 10 times. I've been your brother for so many years, but you haven't even praised me once. Did this woman blow a breath of fairy air to you? Is she King beautiful when she drinks wine and eats petals? The corner of Jinwan's mouth twitched. She didn't care about fairy air. But her behavior was really seen by Mo Jingshan. She really wanted to disappear on the spot. She was going to lose face. Before she fled, Nanheng answered a phone call and left. Jinwan continued to feed him porridge, and Mo Jingshan continued to eat cooperatively. The ward was so quiet that one could hear a pin drop. Only the little woman's embarrassed expression didn't match the silence. Mo Jingshan took a look at her. Jinwan also took a look at him, then put down the bowl and cleared her throat. What you just said is true. Then, what on earth do you like about me? Mo Jingshan looked at the porridge that she had taken away and lowered his eyes to think. You can also understand that I'm bewitched by your beauty. Jinwan resisted the urge to roll her eyes. There are so many beautiful women out there. Even a small celebrity from the entertainment circle would have a certain level of beauty. Do you have to describe yourself as so shallow? The man smiled. Who told you to be so beautiful? Jinwan's heart was trembling from his smile. She couldn't talk to him anymore. She really couldn't talk to him anymore. She really couldn't flirt with him anymore. Jinwan's first reaction was to blush and her heart beat faster. She really couldn't stand this big boss who was said to be cold and unapproachable to be flirting with her seriously. After a few seconds she calmed down a little. My reason tells me that what you've seen and heard about me must be more than that. When on earth did you find out that I was that person? At that time the street lamp was broken, and I couldn't see clearly, let alone you who couldn't even open your eyes. Chapter 319. Jinwan, Mo Jingshan's smile faded. My life is yours. My body and mind are also yours. If you dare to abandon me now, won't your conscience hurt? Jinwan. She abruptly put down the bowl of porridge, pulled up the blanket on the bed and covered his face. The man's body couldn't move, so she covered his face and head. After maintaining this position with the blanket for a full 5 seconds, she was the first to give in and tugged the blanket down with a pained expression. Jinwan's face was cold and she said seriously, get well first. If you get hurt like this again in the future, I'll really abandon you. The man smiled and didn't provoke her anymore. He pointed to the porridge she put on the table. Continue to feed me. For the rest of the day many of the little brothers of 11 Base came to the hospital to visit behind Nanheng and Feng Ling's back, but not everyone could enter Mo Jingshan's ward, not even the people of 11 Base. Jinwan received the call and went down to pick up those little brothers. When Nanheng suddenly came back and glared at them, the little brothers expressed their sympathy and prepared to leave dejectedly. Before leaving, one of them suddenly said with emotion, Mr. Mo, I wish you good health and a happy married life. Because Mrs. Mo is really a good person. Mo Jingshan, who sat quietly on the bed, was not affected by the liveliness here at all. His handsome face was calm, but he raised his eyebrows because of these words. The little brother pointed in the direction of the distant Cambodia. Previously, when we were in Cambodia, Mrs. Mo not only cooked for us, cleaned the house, but also washed our socks. We've been single for more than 20 years, and it was the first time a woman washed our socks. I couldn't bear to wear them. The moment Mo Jingshan heard this, Nanheng directly kicked his butt and chased them out. Get out. They left, and the ward was quiet for a moment. Mo Jingshan turned his eyes to Jinwan. Wash socks. Who ordered you to do it? Without waiting for Jinwan to answer, he turned his eyes to Nanheng. Don't look at me. I don't even believe that eldest Miss Ji can cook. How could I let her do this? Nanheng felt that it was necessary to make those brats run 50 laps around the base after they returned. She's too worried about your safety. She's afraid that she'll let her imagination run wild and find something to do. Jinwan coughed. I did do it myself. There's no need to mention this kind of thing. Just now they were just joking. In fact, I didn't wash many pairs. I was just doing it out of courtesy. Otherwise I'll feel bad if I eat, live and be protected by them. Nanheng snorted. Those brothers whose socks you've washed may face the fate of being target practice by a group of newbies from today onwards. You may feel even more apologetic. Jinwan? I don't think so. Nanheng coldly raised his brows and pointed at Mo Jingshan on the bed with his chin. If you want them to be spared, you have to plead for them. Based on what he said, it wouldn't be good if she didn't plead on his behalf. Jinwan turned her eyes to the bed. Mo Jingshan indifferently glanced at Nan Heng. If you continue to use moral coercion on her, I'm afraid those brothers of yours will become targets for 2 years. Last night, Jin Wan went to the gynecology department for a checkup too late, so there were some other items that she did not check. Jin Wan was called to the consultation room by the doctor. In the ward, Nan Heng tossed his phone onto Mo Jingshan's bed. A private message appeared on the screen. The Su family received the news last night. The moment you entered the operating room they came. With Officer Ents around, they weren't able to enter the hospital. However, after Su Shui was forcefully brought back to America, she must have been frightened by the way the people at the base punished her. It's said that she's been locked up at home and her mental state isn't good. The Su family is still brooding over this matter and wants an explanation from you. Mo Jingshan coldly glanced at the message on the screen. Mental problems? Nan Heng coldly sneered. I think there's an 80% chance that she's really frightened. The psychiatrist visits the Su family every day. It's said that she often doesn't sleep for the entire night. Even the slightest movement would scare her into screaming. The doctor said that she's overly frightened. Mo Jingshan curved his lips slightly, coldly saying, since there's a mental problem, why would they want an explanation from me? I know a psychiatrist in Los Angeles. If they need it, send someone to send her to a mental hospital and treat her. How was this treating her? Mo Jingshan clearly wanted the Su family to lock Su Shui up at home. Now he wanted to lock her up in a mental hospital. However, what Su Shui did to Jin Wan in T-City, if not for Elder Su's face, Su Shui most likely would have lost her life. Elder Su already knows that you've returned to America, Nan Heng said. Are you going to pick up his call? Mo Jingshan's expression was indifferent. No. Late at night, Los Angeles was even colder than the north of China. The wind was biting. In the Su family in Los Angeles, the window of the bedroom on the upper floor of the villa was wide open. A young woman sat by the window, facing the cold wind, holding a glass of red wine in her hand. She took a sip and looked at the stars and moon in the sky. Her ears were filled with the conversation she occasionally heard when she went downstairs during the day. Mo Jingshan has returned to America. He's in the hospital but he can't get in. The police and another group of people are guarding the hospital very strictly. We just want to take advantage of his rare return to America to make up for what Shui has done. Our Shui only went to T-City to seek justice for her cousin. She was indeed very absurd and offended Mrs. Mo, but no matter what happened, the doctor said that Shui's brain was severely damaged and her mental problems were even more serious. Shui is still so young. We can't really let them kill her. Elder Su, no matter what, Shui is your grandniece. She did this for Jilon. Now that Mo Jingshan refuses to see her, you should at least step forward and speak for her. Since Mrs. Mo is unscathed, why would they destroy Shui? She is less than 20 years old, a few years younger than Jilon. The Su family has been friends with Shine Group for so many years and has a relationship with the base. Besides, Jilon used to be engaged to Mo Jingshan, so she can help him. I think it's better for you to solve this problem. Su Jilon gently swirled the red wine glass in her hand and slowly took a sip. Not long after, she became slightly tipsy. Her watery eyes slowly turned to the room and looked at the photo frame on the white shelf beside the bed. In the past 2 years, in order to prevent her from going to him, Grandpa had grounded her and forbade her from leaving Los Angeles or America. Chapter 320. She spent the whole day in Mo Jingshan's ward. At 4 or 5 o'clock in the evening, a doctor came to give Mo Jingshan an anti-inflammatory injection, and Jin Wan returned to her ward. Hospitals in the United States did not advocate injections, but Mo Jingshan's back and head wounds were deep, and he had just had an operation, so he needed continuous anti-inflammatory treatment to prevent infection, so he had to have 2 bottles of intravenous drips. However, the speed of intravenous drips was much slower than in China. It was said that this would reduce the possibility of the drug destroying the human body's resistance. After waiting for more than an hour, a bottle of medicine was not even 1/3 used up, so Jin Wan didn't go back and fell asleep in the ward. When she woke up, it was already midnight, and she was awakened by the ding sound of a text message on her cell phone. She guessed that if she didn't sleep by Mo Jingshan's side, she would really have nightmares. Just now, she dreamed of blood again, but this time, it was not Mo Jingshan but herself who was injured in the blood. Jin Wan opened her eyes with a jerk and sat up. The ward was quiet and dark. She turned to see the screen of her cell phone on the bedside and immediately picked it up to check. Usually, only Xia Tian and Xiao Ba liked to send her messages when they were not busy. She thought it was another call from the studio in High City. But the sender was not a number she was familiar with, but a string of foreign numbers. She received not a text message but a photo. Jean Wan hesitantly stared at the photos, stretched out her finger and clicked on the photos to enlarge them. There were 3 photos. The first one was of the famous Beverly Hills in Los Angeles. Under a row of distinctive European-style buildings, a black limited edition Porsche was parked. The man opened the door and threw something back into the car, and the young woman stood beside him, waiting patiently and leaning her head gently on his back, making an inadvertent posture of snuggling up to the man. This scene was captured in the photo, and the moment she leaned close to him, the sweetness seemed to overflow from the photo. Although the man in the photo had his back to the car door and his expression could not be seen, Jean Wan recognized that it was Mo Jingshan. The young woman's smile was bright and flamboyant. When leaning against his back, she seemed to know that someone was taking the photo and happily raised her hands into a V shape, smiling happily in the direction of the camera. The second picture was not taken. Looking at the slightly blurred pixels, it should be a picture taken from a surveillance camera. In the picture, Mo Jingshan had just stepped out of the elevator. From the scene, it seemed to be the elevator of a private apartment in Los Angeles. The opposite door was open and a young woman came out in a bathrobe. Her hand was in the crook of the man's arm, and half of her body was leaning against his arm. Their posture looked very intimate. The man's face was not in the picture. He was wearing black trousers and a black shirt. It seemed like he had just returned from outside and returned to the home where he lived with his lover. The third photo was a photo of an engagement ceremony. It seemed like the staff of the hotel or somewhere had taken the photo from a distance. The floral decorations and dreamy scenes of the ceremony were all captured in the photo. At the end of the red carpet and flowers, the door of a Rolls-Royce limousine opened. On the red carpet, a tall and slender man in a black suit stood silently without any expression on his face. A young woman got out of the car and walked towards the man. Although the man and woman in the photo were very small due to the background, the moment the woman lifted her skirt and the diamond engagement ring on her hand was captured in the photo. These 3 photos. If Jean Wan understood correctly, the woman in the photo was the so-called former fiancée of Mo Jingshan. What was the purpose of the person who sent her these photos? Not to mention that Mo Jingshan had explained to her about the engagement in the United States a long time ago and had personally solved it. Jean Wan had only expressed her dissatisfaction at being kept in the dark by Su Shui, but she had never distrusted Mo Jingshan. Besides, she had just experienced a life-and-death situation with Mo Jingshan. These photos were taken many years ago, and the person who sent them to her at this time was too obvious. But who on earth was the person who sent her these photos? Was it the woman in the photo or some busybody? Even if she didn't think these photos were very revealing, many of the angles of the photos looked only one-sided intimacy, and Mo Jingshan's expression and face had never been facing the camera. But Jean Wan had to admit that her heart was still a little moved, and her fingers resting on the phone screen felt slightly cold. Was it because they had returned to Los Angeles, and that woman was ready to show up? Jean Wan was still looking at the photos when her cell phone suddenly rang. It was Mo Jingshan calling. She answered the phone. "Why don't you come over to sleep? Aren't you afraid of having nightmares?" The man's voice was warm and light, still a little low and hoarse. It sounded like he had been asked to lie down by the doctor during the injection, and he must have been lying down for a long time. Jean Wan slowly rubbed her hand on the phone, saying, "You just had an operation. I'd better not sleep at your place. I'll sleep there in a few days when your wound is better. Just now, when the doctor knew that I slept at your place in the morning, he specially said that your wound and the operation wound need some time to heal, and you can't make any violent movements. I'm just sleeping with you." "How can I make any violent movements?" The man chuckled. "Jean Wan, the doctor just reminded me. He doesn't want me to disturb your rest." "Well, if you don't come over, I'll go over to accompany you now." No. You can't move or get out of bed now." Jean Wan hurriedly lifted the quilt and got out of the bed. As she walked out, she said, "I'll go over now." "Wait a minute. I'll put on my coat and come over." After getting a satisfactory answer, the man hung up the phone. Jean Wan put down the phone and turned to pick up her coat. When she was about to leave the ward, she paused, lowered her head, opened the page of the photos just now, and deleted the 3 photos and messages from unknown sources. There was no need to keep these things. Jean Wan didn't think she had a strong heart, but when she was in T-City she had said that if the other party wanted to steal her man, she should do it openly and not play any tricks behind her back. So what if she was engaged? She was a legitimate Mrs. Mo. She had never thought that an ex-girlfriend was a terrible creature. Relatively speaking, the more the other party liked to use this method to make her presence known, the less she dared to confront her face to face, and the more she liked to play this kind of trick, the less likely the other party was to win. Chapter 321. In the dead of night, because Mo Jingshan's ward was guarded by the people from 11 base, there was no need for too many medical staff to be on duty, so after avoiding the nurses in her ward, Jin Wan quietly crept to Mo Jingshan's ward. The people from 11 base would not stop her. Although they felt a little strange that Jin Wan would come here so late at night, they just nodded politely to her and let her go. When Jin Wan pushed open the door of the ward and entered, she saw that the head of the man's bed had been shaken again. The man was wearing the same light blue hospital gown as her, and his clean hair was more fluffy and messy than usual because he often lay down, but it didn't spoil his handsome appearance. There was a silver 12-inch laptop on his quilt. At a glance, she knew that the MO Corporation in High City needed him to read some documents. It's only been a day since the operation and you're already working? Jin Wan gently closed the door, walked over and slipped into the man's bed. At this time, Mo Jingshan had finished the injection, and there was only a trace of white transparent medical tape on the back of his hand, but it obviously didn't affect his work efficiency. Mo Jingshan took a look at her and was about to raise his hand to take Jin Wan, who had climbed into the bed, into his arms, when Jin Wan quickly pressed his hand down. "Don't hold me. Don't move your arms." The little woman was now very careful about every movement on his body. Mo Jingshan didn't comment but smiled. "It's getting late. Sleep here tonight and don't go back, okay? I just came here quietly to avoid the doctors and nurses. Now I won't go back even if you drive me back." Jin Wan said, firmly covered the two of them with the quilt, lay beside him and looked at the company documents on his computer. He had been in Cambodia for some time. Although there were vice presidents and many reliable managers and assistants in the company, there were still many final decisions that Mo Jingshan had to deal with personally. Judging from the number of unread emails, it could be seen that there were a lot of backlog of documents. "Do these documents need to be typed?" Jin Wan asked. Mo Jingshan's hand stroked her hair. As soon as Jin Wan finished speaking, he saw that he needed to type a reply. He had just retracted his hand to touch the computer when she suddenly sat up, took the computer away from the quilt in front of him, put her hands on the keyboard obediently, and turned to look at him seriously. "How should I reply? Let me help you." Seeing that she was so proactive, Mo Jingshan did not reject her good intentions. He signaled with his eyes for her to look at the other documents on the screen that had already been approved. "Write your consent here. At the same time, circle the items that need the attention of the company's departments. Let them arrange it themselves." As Jin Wan listened, she quickly typed and highlighted the key points. Half an hour later, there were more than 10 pages of documents. Some required approval, while others required approval or rejection. Previously, when she was in the studio, she sometimes had to face the planning documents submitted by the subordinate departments. However, facing the various documents of such a big company like the MO Corporation, she really felt like an emperor reading the memorials to the throne. The ward was very quiet. Occasionally, a white light flashed on the computer screen when a new email was opened and refreshed. One of them approved the documents on the computer, and the other taught her how to deal with the planning and changes of the various departments. Although Jin Wan had a deeper understanding of some decision-making than before she went to T-City, at this moment, such tacit understanding made her feel particularly hard-won. Usually, in High City, Mo Jingshan was so busy that he almost didn't have a holiday on weekends. Now, while he was injured in the hospital, he could still teach her how to deal with these matters step by step. The next morning, when Nanheng entered the ward, he saw Jin Wan sleeping on Mo Jingshan's bed again. What was more, Jin Wan had obviously come last night and didn't go back to her own ward to sleep. As soon as Nanheng arrived, Jin Wan woke up and slipped out with an embarrassed expression, saying that she wanted to go back to her ward to wash up and brush her teeth. Seeing Jin Wan run away, Nanheng walked in with an expression as if he hadn't slept last night. He pulled a chair over and sat by the bedside, saying, "Elder Su called me last night, and Su Shui's parents went straight to their house to make a scene, asking Elder Su to plead for their daughter. Now that you've turned off your cell phone and are living in the hospital leisurely, accompanying your wife every day, kissing, hugging, and playing romantic games. Elder Su knows about my relationship with you, so he directly came to me. Last night, he called me several times in the middle of the night, causing me to not sleep well last night. By the way, Su Shui's parents are influential figures in the Swan Group. Now they are almost breaking their legs for their daughter, and Elder Su often avoids them. Their dispute has been going on for a long time. Now that you've returned to the United States, it's clear that things have escalated to a certain point. If they don't see you in person, they may directly come to the hospital to make a scene. Nan Heng looked thoughtfully at Mo Jingshan, who was expressionless, leaned back in the chair, picked up an apple on the table next to him and took a bite. I don't think the Su family will give up so easily. Su Shui's parents want to make a scene purely to protect their daughter. But Elder Su, who has never stirred up trouble, now wants to take this matter on his head. Clearly he has ulterior motives, Mo Jingshan said mildly. Nan Heng pondered for a moment. Indeed, Elder Su is here for you. You've been suppressing him for so long, and not long ago, you made a hard plan to restrict the Su family. In the end, Elder Su hasn't even seen your face. An old man who has been all-powerful in the American-Chinese business world for many years definitely won't be convinced. Besides, he still has a precious granddaughter who can't forget about you. All-powerful? Mo Jingshan smiled. For 100 years, the Chinese business circle in the United States has been either black or white. It's not like you don't know which side is behind the Su family's business. In this kind of place, the Su family isn't the only one who can stand firm. Elder Su should be able to tell that your tolerance towards them has been declining. Recently he has been very close to your father. Back then, wasn't it your father, Chairman Mo, who single-handedly arranged the marriage between you and his precious granddaughter? I think he most likely knows that he can't beat you, so he plans to borrow your father's east wind to stabilize himself. Nan Heng smiled faintly. Based on this old fox's usual tricks, he should know that your weakness is Jin Wan. I'm afraid he has already begun to investigate Jin Wan. Aren't you afraid that if she continues to stay in the United States, she will be swallowed by the Su family one day when you're not careful? That you're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.